everyone to the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr. History Club. We meet here every other Wednesday in honor of William Mackey Jr., Dr. Professor Amos Wilson, El Hajj Malik El-Shabab, Brother Hassan, the late great Attorney Alton Maddox, Amos Wilson, Gil Noble, Louis Ray Rivera, Minister Khaled, Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, Ivan Van Sertima, Professor George Simmons, Renogo Rashidi, Brother Harold, and in honor of Miss Leola Maddox, who came to the UAM in a very moderate car, and she drove from Teaneck, New Jersey, all the way to the United African Movement, because she believed in bringing people together. She believed in the live lectures. So we never want to forget Miss Leola. She ate her dinner in the UAM. So that's why we come with the live lectures, because we love to bring people together, no matter how big, no matter how small. So for the people that came out for the live audience, give yourself a great big hand. For the people that's on the Zoom, give yourself a great big hand for supporting the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr. History Club, because we believe in information. Now we're going to bring the camera over to the Amos collection. And this is in honor of Amos Wilson and Sababu with African World Info Systems. These books are to help Sababu continue the great work of Amos. We have Blueprint for Black Power. Book number 2, Black on Black Violence, The Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. Amos's classic that Sababu just finished, The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat Toward a Reclamation of the African Mind. The Falsification of African Consciousness, Issues of Manhood in Black and White, African-Centered Consciousness versus the New World Order, Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children, in honor of Louis Ray Rivera's classic Jazz in Jail, and S.K. Damiana, Distorted Truths and the Bastardization of African Cosmology. So we have these books to help Sababu and African World Info Systems. And I never want to forget my great friend, Louis Ray Rivera. And when Professor Mackey left us too soon, and we didn't have a speaker to come down and take over, Louis Ray Rivera came down, and he would speak for hours and hours and hours. And he took up the mantle. He knew my whole family down Marcy Project. And he lived right on Jefferson. And we would walk him home 3 blocks. And me, Brother Hassan, Brother Colvin, and we would walk him home, and Louis Ray would speak for another hour and a half. So I never want to forget Louis Ray Rivera and his classic Jazz in Jail. So we have a whole bunch of publications here for the listening audience to get and to read, to get information, because what the Mackey's group is about is providing information, and the information is always in the books. So I'm going to start off with the book Dope Incorporated, Lyndon LaRouche's classic. And everywhere you look, you see weed spots, medical marijuana, everybody's selling it and everybody's smoking it. Well, there's one person behind this, and that's George Soros, who controls the Democratic Party. And this is what they have given black youth. Weed, medical marijuana. And in the old days when you smoked a joint, all you did was started laughing and looking for something to eat. I don't see none of these people laughing, and I don't see none of them looking for nothing to eat after they smoke this stuff. So you can thank George Soros and the Democratic Party under Soros. And Lyndon LaRouche did an excellent job, Dope Incorporated. Also, The Destruction of Black Civilization by the great Chancellor Williams. In this book, it'll tell you all the mistakes we made as an African people, from the Arab slave trade to the European slave trade, not the transatlantic slave trade. It'll tell you the mistakes we made as a people in the conquering of those great civilizations in the land of the black. Chancellor Williams did an excellent job, so we never want to forget Chancellor. African slavery in Latin American and the Caribbean countries. Slavery did not just happen in the Americas. It happened all over. So this is a book I just picked up. In honor of Trust Graham and the African Echo Study Group, African or American, Black Identity and Political Activism in New York City in 1784 to 1861. And you gotta remember, in 1863 was the draft riots, where the Irish was hanging us from the lamp pole and burning down the orphanages. The big library on 42nd Street was a children's orphanage, and they burned it to the ground and burnt us with it. Never want to forget what happened to us. So think about what was going on and how we were struggling in 1784. So a lot of people didn't pay no damn dues. They want to reap the benefits, but they didn't pay no damn dues. I want to thank the African Echoes family with this book. Leslie M. Alexander. So we've been fighting this beast for a whole lot of years. Again, in honor of the African Echoes Study Group, African Queen Warrior, Nzinga of Angola, where when she was negotiating with the Portuguese, they wouldn't even give her a chair to sit down. And those African warriors made a seat for her, and she sat on them while she negotiated. This young lady, African warrior. So thank Brother Trust Graham and Brother True and the African Echo Study Group. Also, blacklisted, Dr. Issa, PhD, The Price for Speaking Truth. So Dr. Issa has this excellent book, and he was on Sister Philea's Blog Talk Radio, and I purchased his book. So get his book and support the brother. In honor of Cynthia McKinney, if y'all will have voted for Cynthia McKinney when she ran for president, and in my personal opinion, she's the only one that cared about the people of the great state of Georgia. All them phony balonies down there ain't worth 2 red cents. Of course, they didn't even support Cynthia McKinney on orders from the power structure and the Jews down there. They ran Cynthia McKinney, and the people, she's the only one cared about the people of Georgia. So when Donald Trump opened up his mouth and said how the U.S. creates S-hole countries, when he said the country's an S-hole country, Cynthia McKinney wrote a book that says how the U.S. creates S-hole countries, shithole countries. So you get this book and you'll understand why Donald Trump made that statement. If not, you will run with what everybody says. And this blockbuster book, When China Sneezes, from the coronavirus to the global political lockdown crisis, Cynthia McKinney went beyond the call of duty talking about this book. So we want to salute our sister Cynthia McKinney. Anytime you want to know about somebody, you get the book. A throwaway from South Africa that made millions. So aside from what they tell you, you have to get the book. If you want to learn about the Musk Man, if you want to learn about anybody, you get the books, because there's always stuff in the book that they don't put on social media. Read about these individuals first. Our good friend, Barack Hussein Obama, The Manufacturing of a President by Wayne Mansfield, the CIA insertion of Barack Hussein Obama into the White House. All CIA, baby. And there's another book by Dexter Hartley that talks about Obama. In honor of Dr. Ben, the greatest historian is Dr. Clark, Dr. Ben, black man in the Nile and his family. And Dr. Ben tells you how the pyramids was built, the hieroglyphics, our language and culture, how they built the pyramids, those great civilizations. There wasn't too many computers around. So we never want to forget Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark. They left us too soon. They got another phenomenon. Ladies and gentlemen, when you want to learn about somebody, I'm going to repeat it again. I'm going to repeat it again. George Soros. And this book is the life and time of the world's greatest investor and dirty low down. If you want to learn how he got his millions, how they snuck him out of Hungary and brought him to America, and how he collapsed countries, read about these individuals. He's a bad dude, but he's also dirty. Another book that's of most important, New York Times bestseller, The Shadow Party. How George Soros, Hillary Clinton, and 60 radicals took control of the Democratic Party. And that is who controlling the Democratic Party and some parts of the Republican Party. And if you really want to know how he got his hands into everything, you get this book, and it's relatively cheap. The Man Behind the Curtain. This guy has his hooks and everything. And it tells you how much money he lost on the first Trump election. And it also tells you how much money he lost on the second Trump election. So it's always somebody behind the scenes. And if you notice, they got these guys jumping over backwards. They're doing so many acrobatic flips now that the Don is in office. Every time you turn around, they're on social media and on the internet. But 4 years ago, you couldn't find it. And this new reparations phenomenon, studies. Every time you turn around, they have a study. Every one you hear, reparations. Well, if you go into this book, you will find out who's financing the majority of these people with these committees for this reparations phenomenon. It's in this book. So why would you need another study? This book is called Without Sanctuary. Why would you need another study when you didn't have a study when the Jews got theirs, the Japanese got theirs, they ain't asked for no study. So why would you need another study when you got the hangings? Why would you need another study when you got the beatings? Why would you need another study when you got the hangings? And what happened during the European slave trade? Not the transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic did not enslave us. The European slave trade. Why would you need another study when the book Without Sanctuary? And also, slavery. in Africa and the Caribbean countries and the brutality that not only they did in the Americas, what they did in Brazil, what they did in Jamaica, where they broke you in. And then they just, before they took you to the Americas, they broke you in there, and then they just got barbaric and you was in that slave ship all the way across the ocean. So it's not the transatlantic slave trade. It's the European slave trade. The hangings. And then nobody shows this book when they have these stupid studies. When they have these stupid town hall meetings. And HR 40 been on the shelf for how many years? The bill been sitting up there collecting dust. Tell me about no study. In honor of Io Kamati in his blockbuster, War on the Horizon, the first book, Jews Are the Problem, and the second book, The Psychology of the Jew. Jews are the problem too. We want to thank Io Kamati, the irritated genie out of Washington, D.C. Dr. Scott Whitaker and his blockbuster book, Medicine. He's out of Georgia. The causes and solutions to disease and the malnutrition that is killing the world. This is an excellent book, so we want to never forget. And I have a few here, but you could get the book readily available, Amazon. So now we're going to get down to the blockbusters. COVID is not gone, but you have to read and understand what happened during this global lockdown. And who's behind it? And who's behind it? And if you let them get away with it and don't know what happened, then I feel very much sorry for you. And that's why I salute the Don for putting Kennedy in there. The real Anthony Fauci. And if you really want to see what this dirty, this guy, NIH, did, you get this book. And it has more, even when AIDS came out. Not just the 19. When the AIDS virus came out, that took all our loved ones. So I want to thank Children's Health Defense. Down the 19 rabbit hole. Independent scientists, physicians in the study. Rand Paul, Deception, the Great 19 Cover-Up. And when they had Fauci on and they had the hearings, Rand Paul was on it. Let the vax speak. Let the science speak. Brian Hooker, PhD. Vax versus unvax. This book is based on 100 studies of peer-reviewed literature and considered vaccines versus unvaccinated population. Each study is analyzed. Health difference in infants, and it's a bill up in Albany, and they're having a vote on it where they want to give the babies the shot. They're not talking about the myocarditis. Infant child vaccination schedule. Dermatosis and vaccines. Live virus vaccines, the human papillonian, vaccinations from the war, influenza, hepatitis B, the 19 during pregnancy. This book talks about the massive push to vaccinate the entire global population. Capitalism on a Ventilator is going to tell you about the massive profits that was made in these hospitals that killed our loved ones. This is another blockbuster that I picked up, and I'm on a couple of chapters, and it's The Medical Pharmaceutical Killing Machine, Finding Facts That Could Save Your Life. This is another book. The Wuhan Cover-Up and the terrifying bioweapons race. And now you hear everybody trying to say China and this and that. You can't believe it. You have to do your reading. You have to do your research. Dr. McCullough, The Truth About 19. And it tells you about different stuff. Edward Down used to work for BlackRock. He was an analyst with BlackRock. And they wanted to find out how all these healthy people all of a sudden started dropping. And the insurance, that they was paying out massive amounts of money. And all these young athletes dropping dead on the foot. Strong youngsters, football players, running up and down, kicking soccer balls. What is happening? How did this phenomenon happen all of a sudden? Where people just start dropping. Young, strong, in Canada, all over the world. So they wanted to find out. So Edward Down did the research, and he came out, here's a 29-year-old collapse, leaving fans in shock. Edward Down, a brilliant Wall Street career journalist, financial titan, BlackRock, promoted to managing director 204 during his 10 years there, he added $12 billion to the growth fund. Bad man. So you get this book and you read what BlackRock and what Edward Down did, and he wrote a book. And this is the blockbuster. This is what Pfizer did not want to know, did not want the public to know. They wanted to wait 75 years for the information. Now, 75 years from now, all our asses will be dead. Because if you're 60 and they didn't want to give you the information. So we want to thank Naomi Wolf, Amy Kelly, Stephen Brannan, Kennedy, and they went into the Freedom of Information Act. And one thing you got to thank the Don. You have to thank the Don. The Don opened the file. Donald Trump opened the files on the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of Kennedy, because they killed all of Kennedy's people, and Martin Luther King. And y'all running around talking about what he didn't do. He opened up the files. And are you asking about that? The files are open. You can read them for yourself. You can do the research on the killing of our giants. King, Malcolm, and Kennedy. And you know black folks love the Kennedys. So, the Pfizer papers. And it shows you what happens with the blood. And they wanted to keep this away. The next book that's coming out is the Moderna Files. It was supposed to come out in April, but they withheld it. You can get it back ordered on Amazon. August, it's supposed to be coming out in August. It's called the Moderna Papers. So not only Pfizer, Moderna has the same thing, and they're forcing them to come out with the information. We have to know as the public all these information, what's going on. I wonder what's taking it. Okay, so we're going to have some community events. This is for the listening audience. These are community events that happens on Thursday. We have Thorough Black Talk. Tad, Keisha, Asashay, Sister Mama, Brother Black. That's the hottest show on the East Coast. It's on YouTube, and it's on YouTube. It's on Facebook. It comes on every Thursday at 8 o'clock. Also, our Philadelphia Connection. Blog Talk Radio. That's Sister Empress Chi. El Pollinator, Brother True, Lumumba, out of Philadelphia. They're letting you know everything that goes on in Philly. And that program comes on every Saturday night at 10 o'clock. And you could call in, and it's a live Zoom where you could get in on the conversation with Sister Empress Chi of the Million Women's March. And the telephone number is 1-319-527-6189. So that's Blog Talk Radio. This is one of the hottest programs, Sankofa Revolutionary Radio family. This comes on every Monday at 10 a.m. in the morning. Sankofa Revolutionary Radio. They have news and events. 9 o'clock, you got Dr. Haru. He comes on from 9 to 10. And then after Dr. Haru, you got the Irritated Genie, Ayo Kamati. He has a program that comes on from 10 to 11, and you could get in on the conversation and ask him all about his books, all about his lectures, Born the Horizon. You could call up anything that you don't like, you can ask him. That's Sankofa Revolutionary Radio with Brother Anthony Mohammed, WSYP 95.1 FM. So we want to give Dr. Anthony and Sankofa Revolutionary Radio a great big hand. Our Baltimore connection, Brother Darren Muhammad, State of the City. He comes on sometime Wednesday, sometime Thursday, but the Blockbuster program is on Saturday at 12 p.m. in the afternoon on Instagram and YouTube. Darren Muhammad, and he'll let you know everything that's coming on out of Baltimore. So we want to give big ups to the State of the City, Baltimore, and Darren Muhammad. Every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, Dr. Aline, Your Immunity Project, and also comes on Kalfani Radio. Dr. Alim has an excellent program, and he comes in with all kind of medical information, especially about the 19, and that's a live program, and they even give the listening audience a double header. It's rebroadcasted at 7 o'clock p.m. every Tuesday. And he lets you know what's going on. So we want to thank Dr. Dr. Aline. The African Echo Study Group. That comes on Friday. That's at 8 o'clock. That's out of Newark, New Jersey. Brother Trust Graham, Brother True, Brother Danny, and all the people of the African Echo Study Group. They're doing the psychology of self-hatred and self-defeat toward a reclamation of the African mind. And they come on at 8 o'clock, and then they give you a double header. The Know Thyself Study Group out of Asbury Park. Brother True and Trust is the mediator of that group, and they're also doing the destruction of black civilization. So that's another blockbuster. So they give you a double header. The Semotep family, Dr. James McIntosh, Richard E. Theodore, Betty Dobson. We want to give Dr. Mac a great big welcome for his birthday. He had an excellent birthday party up at Semotep. We had a good time. And his program comes on Tuesday at 10 a.m. on WBAI. It's called The Minefield. And what the Semotep organization and other organizations that came together and put their differences aside, if you have the Netflix and you type in The Good Times Sigma, they took the original series that we loved coming up, filmed in the Cabrini Green Projects, Strong Black Man, Strong Family Values, Esther and everybody. And they actually took it and redid it as one of the most disgusting cartoon stigmas that's out. And if you go on there and see it, I'm asking you, listen, how you think you're going to get some money from somebody that don't even respect you? Hollywood has been degrading us since the movie business, since they get the book, How the Jews Invented Hollywood by Neil Gerbler, and they hated Neil Gerbler for writing that book. course, it tells you how they made money off of us. We pulled Hollywood out of the black with the black exploitation movies. They were suffering. So if we can't stop them from destroying our images on TV and just doing stuff to us, what makes you think somebody gonna give you a damn dime? You ain't gonna get it. So look at that. So we've been rallying and we've been really putting the screws to them. So I want to thank, we was there yesterday, and they also, today they went down to the French Embassy on 42nd Street, D12, and a whole bunch of other organizations to fight for what's happening in Burkina Faso and Chirari, to let them know we know what's going on and we're backing. We are very much aware of what's happening. So they was out at the rally today. All the lectures from the Brooklyn William Mackey Jr. History Club, you can go on YouTube under BK William Mackey Jr. You could do your research, and anything that you have a problem with, you could come down and speak to the speakers. And Dr. Arthur Lewis has done a 12-part series on Burkina Faso and how the world depends on Africa for the natural resources, and how Africa is on the move. They're really making some historical moves that hasn't been done historically. And we are very much aware of it. But that 11-part series on Burkina Faso and Chirari and what's happening in Africa, our good scholar, Dr. Arthur Lewis, has did it. We have it on YouTube. Is she ready?
She's coming.
So we have these. You could go on. So, ladies and gentlemen, everybody's talking about this president, Donald Trump, and all this nonsense. Well, we have an organization where if you put your mind to the UNIA, Garvey, race first, and you join the UNIA, that means you're putting yourself first. And I happen to go out to the store, The Rock. It's a mini Jetro's. It's 13205 Merrick Boulevard, and it's called The Rock. Restaurants buy their supplies from there. They have big freezer, fish, everything you need. And it's 13205 inside Burlap Street. And it's Mondays and Saturdays from 7 to 7, and then Sundays from 8 to 12. They have everything in there. So what we're trying to do at the UNIA is try to weed the people, including myself, from these blockbuster stores where we go out there once a month and we leave Brooklyn and we have a caravan of vehicles, and we take people out to the store, and you can buy your stuff in bulk. The prices is excellent, fruits, vegetables, and you're spending your money with your own folks. So this customer service is unbelievable. So you ain't got to worry about how somebody treating you, what they're saying, and they got a small parking area, but this is the UNIA. So this way, when you put yourself first and join an organization that's geared toward putting you first, you don't have to worry about nobody else. You don't have to worry about it, because you remember the Garvey movement. And that's one thing, they did not want the Garvey movement to survive. Oh, they didn't want Marcus Garvey's movement to survive. So they have the red snapper, oxtail, shrimp, salmon, everything. I was there. I went there last week. So ladies and gentlemen, we have our speaker. And she is a college professor. She is excellent. She has spoken at the United African Movement on numerous occasions. I happen to go to African Echoes one time and I saw her coming out of there talking to Trust. Booker T. Washington is her specialty. And I want to thank Lady V for finally we getting in touch with her to bring her down here so she could do a lecture. I really wanted to get her to give y'all a blockbuster with Keisha for Women's History Month with Keisha one week and then Tyreen Wright the other week, but we finally got her. And ladies and gentlemen, give her a great big hand. She can tell you what she's about. Tyreen Wright, Booker T. Washington, African, the making of Pan-Africanists.
Thank you.
Thank you, my dear.
Thank you. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out for this lecture. Yes, it's been many moons in the making. And let me just put this back here.
You want coffee?
I'm good. So, yes, the book is called Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist. And where do I start? First, yes, the book is about Booker T. Washington. But I want to say even more importantly, it's about us African people. And what we did for ourselves, okay? And Booker T. Washington is just a model of that in terms of the building of an independent African community model that is even now employed throughout the world, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. But also his understanding of nation management and nation building. That is what he gave us. It also is a story of where we were at a particular moment in time. And this period we're going to discuss is called the Nadir. N-A-D-I-R. So it's called the Nadir because it is our lowest point post-enslavement. And it was from 1895 to 1915, which also coincided with something called the age of Booker T. Washington. So some would say he was our appointed leader at a particular time in history. But to be quite frank with you, I don't know who would want to be appointed leader of the Black community during our worst time in history. And he did that, So just to go into a little bit about the book was a product of many years of research about Washington. And I am a Tuskegee alumni, but that I always like to tell people that did not influence me to do this research, okay? Maybe I was a little more interested and I had some inside understanding and access, but it was not my alumni fervor, for Tuskegee that made me write this book. That would have been too, it wouldn't have been enough. Okay, because it was a life work in terms of writing it and pulling together all the information that would culminate in this book. So first and foremost, I wanted to say that Washington in particular, he had his personal papers scheduled to open in the 1970s. In other words, very often people will say, my personal papers, I don't want them to be available to the public until this date. And Washington clearly set some guidelines aside for that. So his personal papers would be edited in the 1970s. And then as a result of the editing of the papers, his personal papers by the Library of Congress, they were made available to the public in the form of 15 volumes of edited papers, 15 volumes each between 200, possibly even 400 pages each. And they would reveal something other than what we knew about Washington in the public realm. In other words, what you probably know about Booker T. Washington is simply he was the counter to Du Bois, he was the accommodationist, he was the less radical one, he was an Uncle Tom even, he was a sellout. And those are things that were in the public realm. But what his personal papers would reveal is he was up to a lot, and he was none of what was said in the public realm. And truth be told, he was actually someone who probably very seldom revealed his face in the public realm, okay? He did not share, and that's funny because we live in an age where we share everything now, but he did not share his plans. He did not share what he was up to. And so his personal papers laid bare all the things he was up to, particularly with regard to Africa, okay, and African people. And he was up to a lot. He changed, just in brief, he changed the trajectory of Liberia. Liberia was in a crisis from 1907 to 1912. Booker T. Washington would be the key negotiator in the Liberian crisis, securing it from French, British, and even German encroachment on the territory. So in other words, those colonial forces were attempting to annex what we know as Liberia today, right? So colonize it. Washington was the key negotiator, the only negotiator behind the scenes in an effort to save Liberia. Also, one of the other things he was up to, and that case is in this book. Also, Washington was involved in a case called the African Exclusion Measure, which is really, really relevant to some of what we have going on today with immigration. Washington would be the person who would challenge a piece of racist legislation proposed and passed by the U.S. Senate that said to exclude anyone of the black or African race from the United States forever, okay? And put them in the same category as criminals and undesirables attempting to enter the country. So this is that case is one of the early examples of the U.S. government in particular criminalizing blackness. And Washington would be the person who would lead the challenge to this piece of legislation and show his measure of power without getting any public accolades or looking for public accolades. He successfully challenged and defeated the African Exclusion Measure, which would have changed the demographic in our communities, right here in places like Brooklyn, where we have African people from all over the world, right? And even more, there are other things he was up to, like propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo, against at the hands of King Leopold and his regime. Washington would propagandize enough to the degree that King Leopold would ask for his aides to contact Booker T. Washington and ask him to stop, because by this point Washington was an international figure and he could influence people who were reading what he was writing. He also would assume an official role in propagandizing against the atrocities of the Congo, as the vice president of Friends of the Congo, organization that still exists today. So if you guys are around, you know Friends of the Congo, Maurice Carney and people like that, they still are involved with Friends of the Congo. Well, they would lobby the White House and the president, a president that Washington advised. He would still lobby him, Theodore Roosevelt at the time, on behalf of the people of the Congo and against the atrocities he was committing, King Leopold was committing in the Congo. In addition to that, Washington had many affiliates and contacts on the continent of Africa who were early African nationalists, early members also of the ANC in South Africa. And he would communicate and correspond with them and share, but also learn a great deal about the condition of African people under European domination and colonialism as it was playing out in real time on the continent. And he had no other way to know what was happening on the ground except for through his direct contact and communications with African nationalists who were on the ground. And then more importantly, one other thing I'm going to touch on is how Washington would export the Tuskegee model once perfected. And he would export the Tuskegee model through his international students. Tuskegee, generally speaking, has a principle that we function under: head, heart, and hand. And the idea was that we have a sacred mission to go back to our communities, places of origins, and build institutions, and own and build industry. If I were to say what Washington's motto was, it would be independence through industry, okay? And a lot of people don't even, know that about Washington, that was the basic principle, guiding principle of Tuskegee, to build industry, to produce industry builders who were educators, but who could also establish institutions and establish industry, right? The idea at Tuskegee, and it relates to an old adage or saying that we had at Tuskegee. When students were preparing to come in the early days of the institution's founding, they would say, "Leave your underwear at home. We make our own at Tuskegee." Because the concept was there was nothing that was a necessity for a man, woman, and child that we did not produce ourselves from start to finish, okay? So the condition of African people the world over, nations, we have the same scenario over and again where we produce raw goods and we sell it on the world market, and we are exploited, okay, what we produce. And then they put it in a can or they put it in a box with a lot of salt and send it back to us, and we buy it and we consume it, and we're not better for it, right? So the idea of Tuskegee was to perfect this sustainable Black community that produced all that we needed. And there was a programmatic aversion to producing raw goods or unfinished products. So if you were making a sole of the shoe, you must also know how to make the shoe. If you could make a wheel, you must be able to produce the wagon. And so at Tuskegee, there were 44 industries, and Booker T. Washington, once he had perfected the industries at Tuskegee, he gave it, like we all do, we give what we perfect to those we love. He sought to share this with the African world, and it would be through his international students, of which he had a steady stream of students coming from the African continent as early as 1893. Specifically, we know there was a student coming from Liberia at that time. And so some of these things would be what Washington is trying to protect in the case like the African exclusion measure. If the US government locks out all African people, then that means they lock out the steady flow of students coming from the African continent, but also coming from the Caribbean, Central and South America, of which there were many who came to Tuskegee because it was a hub. Okay, so I'm gonna just get into the details of the book, and I can't cover everything, but I want to speak to the parts that are literally irrelevant to the times that we are living in, because I think there's so much that Washington did and that he did through the institution called Tuskegee that still reverberates right now throughout the world. And I will deal with some of the controversial issues like Du Bois in Washington. That is a fallacy. I just did a lecture where I spoke about that because I usually assume that people figure it out after sharing some information that wasn't real, okay? But I realized in giving that lecture that I need to say that it wasn't real. that the conflict between Du Bois and Washington was in fact not real. It was created by white liberals in particular in the academy that created it and maintained it and have at least 100 years of scholarship perpetuating it. And the unfortunate thing that has happened with Booker T. Washington is that we have allowed a monopoly of his legacy to lay in the hands or to be a monopoly by white scholars, namely Lewis Harlan, who we allowed to define him, to write a number of biographies on him, to write numerous articles on him, and about Tuskegee, to preserve to be involved in the editing and preservation of his personal papers, although Harlan could not, they were transcribed, so he couldn't change that, but he, did a little dirt in the editorial notes, for sure. There are numerous errors because he was not committed to the task. But that is where we fall short. So this is why I wrote this book, because as a historian, I think it's always a sacred mission. Most of the time, I'm dealing with ancestors, right? And so when you are called to do certain work, then you do it and you bring justice to it. And so this book is a direct challenge to the academy in their interpretation of Washington. It's a disruption of the monopoly on the legacy of Washington, and it affirms what he was doing and what the work he did is still doing, okay? So, without further ado, I'll get into the first issue at hand, which is just that point. Lewis Harlan, a man who was born somewhere around the turn of the century, 20th century, 1900s, he would be Booker T. Washington's primary biographer. And I am not the first to highlight this, okay? We have to, as researchers, we always give a nod to those who come before us and did some or part or, made some contribution to uncovering things. And there are several who actually did that. I'm feeling for my glasses. Okay, so I don't have them, but I'll still do it. They're over there. It's okay. I got it, it's fine. Well, maybe it's not, but nonetheless, it's over there. You see a hat, and inside that hat, you'll see any pair of glasses. Okay. Yes. How embarrassing. Yes, I need my glasses. I'm feeling for them. I had several pairs. Thank you. Yeah, here we go. This is a good pair. So, thank you. So, I want to just to give you context so you can really fully understand what we're dealing with. And in the preface, I won't read it, but I will give you some of the highlights. In the preface, I attempt to set the stage for people to understand why this work was necessary, what happened with Booker T. Washington, and why this monopoly on Washington had to be interrupted. So this is about Lewis Harlan. Lewis Harlan, as I said, Washington's key and main biographer. Lewis Harlan, unlike anyone else in history, had the rare opportunity to monopolize the interpretation of an African American icon and leader. The travesty is Harlan's work has gone unqualified, unchallenged, and beyond reproach. Lewis Harlan openly admitted and discussed his general disdain for Booker T. Washington. In Booker T. Washington, A Reexamination, historian Robert Norrell sheds light on the issue in his essay, The Legacy of Tuskegee. He wrote, Harlan was a very talented historian and a fine writer who has an amazing hostility to Booker T. Washington. One wonders why a person who is so negative and so hostile towards a historical figure would choose to write a biography about him. Lewis Harlan will tell you that he began a study in the 1960s with the assumption that Washington was an Uncle Tom. And Lewis Harlan is indeed an Anglo-American, white American. That he was a sellout. And then he worked on research and writing about Washington for the next 25 years. He has said that along the way, he became more respectful of Washington because he wasn't purely a sellout, just a sneaky, underhanded man. So what I'm saying is that that quote came from a scholar named Robert Norrell, who noticed that Lewis Harlan had a monopoly. He had written both Washington's biographies, and he also wrote numerous, too many to count probably, articles on Booker T. Washington. And then he also got a big grant from the Library of Congress to edit Washington's personal papers. And I actually know the head archivist who was there when Harlan would come and edit the personal papers. And I know the assistant archivist, she's still with us, and I've known both of them for many, many years. They both said that Harlan was not committed to the endeavor, okay? So, you know, it's his profession. He's making money, okay? And so he has no commitment to Washington, nor was Washington his own. You understand? They were not the same people, and no one was confused about that. However, he was able to do all of this, build his career off of Booker T. Washington, even though he had publicly gone on record in this particular essay that I saying that he thought he was an Uncle Tom. Now, isn't that interesting that a white person could say a black person is Uncle Tom? What do you know of that? Or a sellout, or anything, right? For that matter. My contention is that, you know, our leadership is for us to weigh and measure, period. Okay? Good, bad, and indifferent. And so for me, as the researcher and writing of this book, I was prepared to tell the truth, whatever that was, right? But of course, I suspected the truth was good. So, but I was prepared to tell the truth as a member of the community that Washington saw himself as serving, okay? Lewis Harlan's perspective had a significant impact on the work he produced, which in turn has shaped discourse on Booker T. Washington for decades. This book attempts to disrupt that monopoly by Lewis Harlan and other Western scholars who were allowed to define Booker T. Washington, his legacy, and the Tuskegee model. It is clear Harlan did not view Washington in a favorable light, nor did he have the ability to view him fairly. Robert Norrell, with uncanny accuracy, pointed out Harlan's problematic posture and position on Booker T. Washington. So here's more from Norrell. It is remarkable to see the way that the Du Boisian, yes, Du Bois, interpretation of Washington is almost entirely adopted by scholars. Essentially, whatever Du Bois said about Washington is embraced. First by Van Woodward, who was another young scholar, and then by his student Lewis Harlan, and then by subsequent scholars. By now, almost 2 generations of scholars writing about American race relations have essentially followed what Du Bois said and adopted his very biased view of Washington. It is remarkable. I am not aware of any other historical circumstance in which one person who is the avowed enemy of another, the pages are thin, figure of another historical figure gets to essentially establish what the historical reputation of the other person is. And that is essentially what has happened with Booker T. Washington. This is why we don't know this story. This is why it wasn't taught to you. And my personal opinion is that if you could turn the people against Washington, okay, and employing what were practical and effective models for us to nation build, then they will never access that. They will throw it all away, right? You know, it's just, and it's very potent, because I can say as someone, and this is where my inside understanding comes from, I can say as someone who was a student at Tuskegee, we have freshman orientation, and we have to read up from slavery. And, but hopefully we'll do better. Maybe they'll read this book. But the point is that we have to read up from slavery. And many of us come there and say that Booker T. Washington was an Uncle Tom, because we don't know any better, right? We don't know any better. That's what we were taught. Du Bois was the progressive one. Nonviolent, direct protest, that Du Bois is the father of that scholar activist tradition. He is. Washington was something else, but nothing less, meaning that what he did was just as great and useful, and possibly even more useful than what Du Bois gave us in terms of models, okay? Because all the models Du Bois would create, or all the organizations Du Bois would create, he would then later on go to criticize because they did not serve their purpose. Okay? That's whether it is the Boule or the Niagara movement or even the NAACP or any of his other organizational affiliations. He would grow consistently enough to want to eventually criticize those very entities that he gave life to. Now, Washington's methods and traditions would stay intact. And I think, you know, the period that we're talking about, you had many independent African communities. We know about Black Wall Street, you know, Greenwood section, right, of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But that was the least of them. There were many, and Washington would be a key figure in helping to establish many Black communities throughout the South. Numerous. Johnny Ford just recalled that. He was a longtime mayor of Tuskegee. He just recalled that last year at our 125th Centennial Black Business League Conference, which is also an organization that Booker T. Washington created. It used to be called the Negro Business League. Now it is called the National Black Business League, or NBL, right? So, to go on, so point being is that no one has been more maligned by the Academy than Booker T. Washington. And it became such a thing that most scholars don't touch Washington. Before you can finish saying the names, you don't need to do that. No, you don't need to look into that. But my view and vision for this work was that this history belongs to our people. And so this book it eventually gets into the Academy, but it didn't go to the Academy initially. It was a grassroots book because this history belongs to us. This is the history of our people at a certain time. So, first things first, Washington was part of the Pan-African movement. He would be the first one to call it a movement, and that simple Google search would bring you that information. And you will see that he is the first person in the Black press to talk about the first Pan-African Conference as a movement. That this would not simply be a conference, but this would in fact be a movement set upon his way. And his words couldn't have been more true. 1900 would mark the first Pan-African Conference in the UK, unfortunately. However, it was organized by an organization called the African Association, and the secretary of the African Association was none other than Henry Sylvester Williams. You may know his name. He is from Trinidad, and they would take base in the UK, in London, and begin to organize the first Pan-African Conference. This was important because most people don't know Washington was a part of the plenary sessions for the first Pan-African Conference. And he would invite Du Bois to be a part of those plenary sessions, okay? So the two of them would engage around the plenary sessions. And, you know, there's a rumor, a fallacy that goes around that says Washington did not attend the first Pan-African Conference because he was angry at Du Bois or they had a fight. No, none of that is true. Du Bois and Washington had a very positive relationship for the first 9 years that they knew each other. Okay, it was more a mentor-mentee relationship. Du Bois would come to Tuskegee from Atlanta sometimes, once he is at Atlanta University, which is now Clark Atlanta University. He spent summers, and we can document this, so let me just be very clear. Yes, I love all of this, but what we're talking about is documented fact, right? So we can put Du Bois in Tuskegee on numerous occasions, and even in the summer of 1903, where he is staying at the Washington's house as their guest and spending time in Tuskegee. And if you know anything about the area, Tuskegee is definitely an escape from the busy Atlanta reality. That being said, Washington and Du Bois would both be involved in the first Pan-African Conference, and Henry Sylvester Williams would write Booker T. Washington asking him to be a part of this conference. Clearly, Henry Sylvester Williams knew something about the work that Washington was doing behind the scenes at Tuskegee, because he actually asked him to present a paper on lynching first. And Washington agreed. Later on, before the conference would take place, he would say, well, can you do a paper on sustainability? That also let me know that Henry Sylvester Williams clearly knew about the work that Booker T. Washington was doing at Tuskegee. That being said, Washington accepted on both, but he would not make it to the conference. conference. Du Bois would make it to the conference, and he would represent the youngest at the conference, and he would be the sole survivor, meaning after the first Pan-African Conference, Du Bois would be the only one to survive by 1919. And he would be the initiator of the Pan-African Congresses, right? The continuous conference that would be held for the Congress. So in other words, Du Bois is the only survivor of the 1900 conference, the first, and he would initiate the Congresses, which were continuous. Those of you who know Pan-African history, you know that this is a staple in terms of the history, recalling of the history. The first conference and then the Congresses, of which the fifth Pan-African Congress was the most important historically and significant because it gave a setting for African leadership to establish, to engage in ideological struggle around what was to come, which was the struggle for African independence and throwing off the cloak of colonialism, right? So Du Bois, you know, he had no idea that what he would do, but that is one of his major contributions. That being said, how did this first conference come about? Henry Sylvester Williams writes Booker T. Washington, and all of this book is based on correspondence, actual correspondence to and from Washington, documented through the Booker T. Washington papers. So, I will quote Henry Sylvester Williams. He writes to Booker T. Washington in 1898, and he extended membership to Washington while enlisting his assistance in promoting the organization in the United States, meaning the African Association. He wrote, "I take you are alive to the necessity of a general union among the children of the descendants of Ham, as it would tend to create a respect for us, which he believed did not exist." Washington agreed and was eager to promote the organization. The objective of the African Association, as described by Henry Sylvester Williams, was to respond to the need for unity amongst African people in order to garner respect in the world. The organization would make representations in cases of oppression affecting our people, wherever found. That's Henry Sylvester Williams talking. During the latter part of 1898, the association began planning the first Pan-African Conference. In order to advance their aims, in June of 1899, Williams wrote Booker T. Washington from London regarding the conference and enclosed a circular requesting that Washington or a representative of his choice present a paper on lynching in the United States. Washington accepted the invitation and promised to make it known widely as possible. He not only promoted the conference through the black press, which he had significant control of, he outlined the agenda and deemed it a very important movement on the horizon. So Washington would write that himself, right? He would deem the Pan-African movement a very important movement that is on the horizon. The organization's desire to create a body that would foster unification amongst African people internationally was a much needed and progressive endeavor, according to Booker T. Washington, and therefore worthy of his support. So most people don't know that he was behind the scenes involved in that. Later on, as I said, Henry Sylvester Williams would ask him to present on sustainability, right? But ultimately, Washington did not attend the conference. Du Bois would. And not instead, but just Du Bois would. Meaning that Washington was unable to attend the conference. Now, one of the things I want to touch on in order to explain some things, Booker T. Washington, in a more pointed way, talks about his feelings, views, and desires as it relates to Africa and African people. You can read all about it in a book called The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery, written by Booker T. Washington. Very likely edited by a man named Robert Parks. But in that book, Booker T. Washington tells you all about his predilections, his views, and why he himself ultimately wanted to go to Africa, right? So we don't even have to leave this up to people like me. Washington actually told the world what he thought about Africa, African people, his connection to African people, which was his mother, okay? He understood that his mother was an African person. He had a relationship, close relationship with his mother. And as far as he was concerned, a people that could produce someone like his mother had some good in them that geographers, and he should have said historians, had failed to discover. But this is his first desire, his desire to know his mother's people. Puts him on this journey and path to discover Africa, okay? And he writes about it, all about it, in The Story of the Negro. Much in the way he talks about his own story up from slavery, he attempts to tell the story of African people from our home. In the book refers to Africa as home, okay? He uses the word Negro, he says the Negro at home. Not America. He's talking about Africa. And if you're confused about it, there's a good 200 pages of the book to help you understand that he is talking about Africa and African people in every aspect. Culturally, okay, personally, all of these things. And the diversity of the language, the diversity of the cultures. He shares all of that. The only problem with the story of the Negro and why we don't know about it is because the conversation at that point in time, the turn of the century, 1900, was the conversation around enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, okay? Equal protection under the law, naturalization, and the right to vote. Okay, that very controversial 14th Amendment, which comes out of the Black freedom struggle. One step out of enslavement. We are raging, okay, for our rights and for full citizenship and for all the protections that come with the Constitution. Du Bois was born on the eve of that, 1868, February 1868. And he is a product of his time. He is pushing that conversation because he wants and he feels like he is that person who has a right to the full protection under the law. These are amendments that come out of our struggle. We fought a war. And we were victorious. We defeated the institution of slavery here. Let's be clear. There was an institution that was 250 years old here called enslavement. Okay? We're not even on the other side of freedom for 250 years. We were in this country enslaved longer than we have been free. And so these amendments would come out of the Black freedom struggle. And as far as Du Bois was concerned, it was written in our blood. And so it had better be enforced. That was his energy. That was his sentiment. And so there was no conversation above it as far as Du Bois was concerned. These amendments had to be enforced. We had fought, we had won. We are on the other side. And here is Washington. That is not his conversation. He is doing a lot, but he is not talking about it, okay? He is of a different cloth, but not of different values. All right, he has the same values, and we'll see, you know, as I get a little further into this. So the story of the Negro, the rise of the race from slavery, Washington telling about our origins at home on the continent of Africa, our journey across the sea, our journey through slavery, our victory over it. That was not the conversation of the day. The population is talking about social and political rights, right? We survived all of that. We got Reconstruction amendments to enforce these things. And in 1877, we were thrown back in time with the end of radical Reconstruction and lost a great deal of what we had gained. What we had gained was independent African communities within the United States. And the answer to this swift progress we made in the first 50 years out of enslavement, the answer was with violence. Okay? That is what the Nadir is about, 1895 to 1915. Was white America's violent response to African black progress in this country. I mean, the ones who were on board with Reconstruction, which put 2,000 black people in local, state, city, and federal government positions. Their response was like, okay, you guys have done enough. You've gotten far enough, you know, 250 years of slavery, 50 years of freedom. You're moving very fast. Let's put a stop to it. No problem, right? It enraged white Americans, to be quite frank. Yes, it did. And the response was with sheer violence. We don't have to compete with you. We'll kill you. That's it. Right? The people in power make the rules, and they were in power, and they made the rules, so they could engage. And there were numerous. We could do a whole, I don't know, weeks-long conference on what took place during the Nadir, how we were attacked and terrorized strategically in this country. Okay, so that is why you don't know about the story of the Negro, because it was smothered by the social and political conversation of the day, right? So it sounds almost crazy to put Washington's name in the same sentence as Africa, but he was very much connected to Africa and to African people, and thought quite a bit about it. So if you are interested in his views around that, read The Story of the Negro. One of his personal ambitions was to go to the continent of Africa one day. He didn't know anybody who went to Africa except for missionaries who were affiliated with churches. And so what did he do? He wished he could, and he never did. But eventually, at some point, he has this institution, and he was unbelievably committed to Tuskegee, which was his baby. And so he would seek to put Tuskegeans and the ideas and the mission and the vision of Tuskegee on the African continent as a gift to African people. Okay? So moving right along, that leads me to Du Bois. I'm just going to go right into it. I'm not going to make you wait for it. This is probably the most controversial thing that you know about Washington, which was his relationship with Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois would meet Booker T. Washington in 1894. His first letter to Washington is in this book. He would write Washington on many occasions asking for a job. But he would also be interviewed by Booker T. Washington, and he writes all about this. This goes to show you how a lot of what we consume in the public realm about our leadership is usually just propaganda. Because if you wanted, you know, people who are interested, if they wanted to know what Du Bois thought of Washington, they wouldn't read what any scholar said. They would go right to Du Bois' words, because Du Bois said it himself. Okay, and I will tell you the sources. They're right here. But Du Bois would explain his relationship to Booker T. Washington in detail after Washington's death. But here are the facts. In 1894, after graduating from Harvard with a doctorate in history, Du Bois contacted Washington in search of employment. On July 27, 1894, he wrote, "President Washington, sir, may I ask if you have a vacancy for a teacher in your institution next year? I am a Fisk and Harvard man and have just returned from 2 years abroad as scholar from John F. Slater Trustees. My specialty is history and social science, but I can teach German, philosophy, natural science, classics. Your wife knows of me, and I refer by permission to President Gilman, Johns Hopkins University." So that was Du Bois' first letter to Booker T. Washington, and he was seeking a job. He was a Fisk man for sure, because Du Bois was not allowed to go to Harvard on undergraduate. He was sent to Fisk. That's a whole story. That being said, yes, he was sent to Fisk, and afterwards he would come back and go to graduate school at Harvard. However, Fisk was also the institution that Margaret Murray Washington would attend. And so she knew of Du Bois. Margaret Murray Washington was Booker T. Washington's third wife. No, he did not have 3 wives at the same time, one at a time. And she was his third and last wife. So when he writes him, he says, hey, you can ask your wife. She knows of me, right? Washington would affirm him and respond favorably, but Du Bois did not come to Tuskegee to teach at that moment in time. He would then go to a number of schools and teach, but he would again write Washington some years later and ask for a job again. At this time, he's understanding a little bit more about the work he wants to do. He wants to put on foot a more scientific study of the African condition in America. Okay, and he talks to Washington about that in this letter. He says, "Dear Mr. Washington, I feel that I should like to work at Tuskegee if I could be of service to you." Hello. My idea has been that there might gradually be developed there a school of Negro history and social investigation, which might serve to help place more and more the Negro problem on a basis of sober fact. I think that in time, various colleges like Harvard, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the UPenn would join in supporting such a movement. What do you think? At present, I know just how I could be of service. I can teach most primary and secondary branches, preferring, of course, history, economics, social problems. I have had an indication that I may possibly expect an offer from the University of Pennsylvania for a year, after which, if needed, I could come to Tuskegee, perhaps have the active aid of a great college like the University of Pennsylvania. In any case, I am willing and eager to entertain any proposition for giving my services to your school. That is from Du Bois to Booker T. Washington, okay? So, you know, we don't have to speculate. This is the great thing about history, right? Our ancestors left it all laid out. We have to access it. And we should have an aversion to secondhand information, okay? And this is primary. This is right from Du Bois himself to Washington. So Du Bois would not come to teach at Tuskegee. However, he would go on to the University of Pennsylvania on a one-year fellowship and produce one of the greatest works that people still talk about, which is the Philadelphia Negro. Okay, a scientific study of the black population in Philadelphia. It is used as a model to this day. But the University of Pennsylvania, I don't want to say too much about him, but he didn't have an office. Harvard, PhD, still sat in the hallway, okay, without an office, right? So that being said, Du Bois clearly wanted to work at Tuskegee, clearly wanted to engage Washington in the institution, and this leads to the conversation about what was Tuskegee to begin with. Generally speaking, I'm sure if I asked you, most of you would say it's a vocational and industrial school, right? Because that was the conflict, vocational education versus social sciences and intellectual development or scholarly development. And the truth is that Tuskegee was not at all a simply vocational and industrial school. It wasn't that at all. The founding of Tuskegee will tell you very clearly it was a school for teachers. Okay? We are all teachers. Even our aerospace engineers, which we produce at Tuskegee, are teachers because it is a teaching school. We are a school of teachers that educated you in the academics and then gave you the opportunity to perfect two industries. Okay? Not simply to practice them, but to go on and establish institutions that taught those industries or those vocations. So Tuskegeans were designed by Washington to be educators who established institutions that were in the industries, okay? So industry builders. And I will get a little more into that in terms of the full design of Tuskegee, but it was never simply a school for vocational education. That was the least of it. From the inception of the institution, the school had pedagogy. No one in this world cares about pedagogy but a teacher or a professor. It is the art of teaching. From its inception, the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee taught history, okay, and civics and things of that nature, because it was always a school for teachers. So Du Bois wasn't crazy. He wasn't asking to come and teach at a vocational industrial school. He already knew that it was a school that produced more college-educated blacks than anything else, okay? And so he wanted to be a part of that. Du Bois and Washington would have a good relationship for the 9 years, 1894, that first letter was written. They would have subsequent interaction and meetings, and Du Bois would even be at Washington's house. We can place him in Tuskegee. The only reason why I refrain from saying Du Bois on an off summer or at some point taught a course or two at Tuskegee is because I was never able to locate a syllabus. But he, in fact, was at Tuskegee quite a bit. In the summer of 1903, this is when the conflict would arise, not because of Souls of Black Folks written and published by Du Bois, but because of what happened in the summer of 1903 after Du Bois stayed at Washington and his family's house. After staying with Washington, he would travel to Boston to go see none other than who? Some of you might know, Monroe Trotter. Monroe Trotter was one of Washington's chief critics in the public realm. While Washington had significant control of the black press, Trotter had his own paper, and he could level criticism. Washington did not like that, of course, and it was through the black press that Washington had say in the black community, okay? Period. Du Bois, after spending the summer with Washington, would travel to Boston, see Monroe Trotter, spend time with him, congratulate him on his handling of the riots in Boston, the race riots that summer at that time. Washington obviously would see this. Washington did not care for this. The ideas that you come and you break bread with me and my family, you coalesce with us, you stay in my home, right, with my wife, my children, and then you go and you rub elbows with my very public enemy and chief critic in the public realm, which was Monroe Trotter. Washington had a problem with this, but not the kind of problem that he would take to his grave, okay? Not the kind of problem that he would take to his grave. I know that for a fact because I can see through his personal papers what he was saying about Du Bois in the final moments of his life. He was still wondering why they could not come together overwhelmingly, okay? But he did not harbor a seething hatred or disdain for Du Bois. It was not like that. He was the senior of the two. It was more a mentor-mentee relationship, okay? Du Bois is writing the president of the institution to ask for a job. Is the relationship not clear? They were not peers. They were contemporaries, but they were not peers, right? That being said, Du Bois' issue with Washington was a little more deep. Du Bois was young. We don't know how much younger he was than Washington because Washington was born in slavery, in enslavement. So we don't know the exact day or time, and we can only speculate about the year. Some say 1858, 1859, early April. We don't know that to be a fact one way or another. That is the scar, the mark of enslavement, that you are born without record, right? That being said, Du Bois was younger, born in a different context, different time, not in enslavement. He was the most brilliant in his white school. He probably expected to go to Harvard from the beginning, but he was black. He was an orphan. He was a charge to the community, and they sent him where they thought he should be, which was to a black school run and founded by whites, Fisk. I'm not knocking it, that's just the facts. There are a number of black schools founded by white people, and then there are some black schools founded by black people for black people. Fisk is founded by white people for black people, okay? And that is where they sent Du Bois. Du Bois, like I said, he believed in the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. No, he didn't fight for them. He was just born when they were established. That being said, he believed that the future was in the enforcement of the Reconstruction Amendments, and that's understandable. Okay, I would too. That being said, Du Bois' chief issue and problem with Booker T. Washington was something very simple but profound. It was Booker T. Washington's use and abuse, in his own words, of the Tuskegee machine, which was Booker T. Washington's secret network where he controlled the black community and politics in the country in general. Booker T. Washington, as some of you may know, he was an advisor to two American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, and then President Taft after him. So he had significant insight into how any given president's administration would go. Du Bois was aware of this, but the Tuskegee machine was comprised of some of the individuals that was on Booker T. Washington's Board of Trustees at Tuskegee. And the Board of Trustees generally were known to the public once Washington established the institution. However, this secret network called the Tuskegee Machine, which some were publishers, but most were power brokers in some way or another. And they were a part of his network. Any appointments, jobs, there are people who complain about jobs that they thought they should have gotten without, but did not get the nod of Booker T. Washington. I'm not defending any of it, but the point is that this is the way in which he controlled the black community. Yes. Sometimes to the obvious benefit of Black people, sometimes not so obviously to the benefit of Black people. That being said, Du Bois understood that one of the functions of the Tuskegee machine was its capability to silence younger activists, leaders who did not agree with Booker T. Washington. And he did not like this. He criticized it, not openly to Booker T. Washington's face. Later on, he is very candid about it, and we'll get into it. It is here. That being said, Du Bois would write The Souls of Black Folks, and he describes how he wrote it. It wasn't with the objective to criticize or malign Booker T. Washington. He would throw that in the latter part of the book. But he will say on his own that The Souls of Black Folks was comprised of a few fugitive pieces that he had put together. And that it was really the last part of the book where he added this chapter of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. And that would be the chapter that people think would cause the break between them, because he created this vocational and industrial education versus scholarship versus academic and study of the social sciences, so we could understand our condition and problem. But in reality, Du Bois knew then, as he would write and share later on, that that was not his real issue with Booker T. Washington. And let me liken it to, or compare it to, just everyday life. You have a friend, you have a falling out. Other people come to ask you about your falling out. You don't want to talk about the real issues between you all, because you know this is going to be in the public realm. So you talk about a pseudo issue, something you don't like, but is not the real chief issue between you. It's not the intimate issue. Perhaps he felt like he was not betraying Washington by, doing that instead, creating this pseudo issue that existed between them. But Du Bois would be honest after Washington's death and share that it was none of that, and that his chief issue with Booker T. Washington was the Tuskegee machine. So, in the latter part of 1903, Du Bois' well-known critical piece on Washington contained in The Souls of Black Folks became public and exposed the apparent break between them. The book challenged Washington's agenda and challenged his failure to participate in the demand for social and political equality in the United States. However, Du Bois later wrote a more honest essay titled My Early Relations with Booker T. Washington. Hello, you can find it today. Which detailed the real issues that divided them. Du Bois confirmed the source of their conflict was not opposing programs for the African American population in the U.S. It was Washington's use and abuse of his secret network, the Tuskegee Machine. Du Bois accused Washington of silencing any opposing views that could possibly appear in the press. The Souls of Black Folks, which was published shortly after Du Bois' interviews with Washington for a position at Tuskegee, and right after they both attended the plenary sessions for the Unified Program for the Negro in America, offered a philosophical explanation for the rift between the two men. The Souls of Black Folks articulated the opposing philosophies and gave life to the public discourse around the conflicting programs for African Americans at the time. The details of their relationship and Du Bois' subsequent disenchantment with Washington would affect the vein in which he discussed Washington in the book. However, Du Bois admitted that the book was comprised of a few fugitive pieces, meaning we all as scholars write stuff and it never sees the light of day. Well, that's where they went. They went into the souls of black folks for him. And to that, he included the chapter titled Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, to which he sought to make a frank evaluation of Booker T. Washington. He left out the more controversial matter, the bitter resentment which young Negroes felt, and this is a quote, this is Du Bois talking, and that's why the term Negro is being used, which young Negroes felt at the continued and increasing activity of the Tuskegee machine. He concentrated on the programmatic and philosophical differences between the two. The compilation would become internationally known and shaped the Du Bois versus Washington debate for decades to come. However, Du Bois' real grievance against Washington, that he silenced all those in opposition to him or his institution through the Tuskegee machine, was completely excluded from the book. And yes, you can go to the Schomburg. There's a book that has many of Du Bois's essays in it, and you can find My Early Relations with Booker T. Washington, where he talks about his personal issue with Washington being able to silence young intellectuals, scholars, and activists and leaders of his day. And of course he felt that way, because he's thinking, you could silence me the day I don't agree with you, right? Clearly, that's how he felt. And so what takes place is that this conflict takes on a whole new life, as a life of its own, as a result of the publication of this book. And the pseudo conflict and narrative begins to snowball till today. There are still people, there are scholars who have documented the 100-year history, scholarship of writing about this pseudo conflict. If only they would go back and read Du Bois himself, where he admits in this essay and on after that one, there was no programmatic conflict, okay? Du Bois was not intending to go to Tuskegee to teach wheel writing or shoemaking, because that was not the only thing being taught at Tuskegee. He knew that he could engage in scholarship and scientific study of African people in Tuskegee. Matter of fact, Tuskegee would have been one of the best places for him to do that. If you've read Kwame Ture's Black Power, you know about the political activity of Tuskegeans during the Reconstruction period and after. So Du Bois was aware of all of that. He was very aware of that. And he would admit later on that there was very little difference between him and Washington. He would write that, okay? That being said, we have unfortunately allowed the Academy to take this and run with it and create a whole narrative that is not true to the history. But there's great irony in this context with Du Bois and Washington, because hopefully, you have to give me a time check. Before I get to the end, there is one case that I mentioned, the African exclusion measure. And this challenge to that racist piece of legislation would bring Washington and Du Bois together. And they are aligned against this piece of legislation proposed and passed by the Senate to lock anyone of the Black or African race out of America from 1915 on, okay? And they are aligned in that. However, it is Washington's use of the Tuskegee machine in that case that gave us victory in that situation. And I'll get into the details. But before I move on, I'm reading from the chapter called Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanists. And I can't read the chapter without addressing none other than the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, who came to the United States for one reason and one reason only, and who came with an invitation from one person and one person only. He came with an invitation from Booker T. Washington. He came to see the model, the sustainable model that is known as Tuskegee Institute at the time. Okay? And how this would happen has everything to do with Washington perfecting this model. In 1912, Booker T. Washington would decide to hold a conference. It is called the International Conference on the Negro. I say that in many ways this was Washington's Pan-African Conference, because what he would do is open up the 44 industries at Tuskegee for examination by the African world. And the idea was that they would come and see all of the industries that are there and take back best practices. Because what we know about building industries is that that is the cornerstone of nation building, to own and operate your own industries. Each and every African country on the continent and out in the diaspora today, the only reason we can be exploited is because of not having and owning our own industries. Even more, Washington was all about not simply owning and operating the industries, but building industry and teaching others how to build industry. So the idea was to consume to produce all that you consume. Okay? Hence the motto, leave your underwear at home. We make our own at Tuskegee. We don't need anybody else. We are making it here. Okay? And so in 1912, the International Conference on the Negro would take place at Tuskegee. People would come from all over the African world, the Caribbean, Central and South America, and the continent of Africa. Casely Hayford from the Gold Coast would come from the continent, present-day Ghana. And at this conference, the industries were open up, they were able to examine them and take back best practices. And in the resolutions of the conference, there was an initiative to erect a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica. At the conference, there would be 8 educators from the island nation of Jamaica. And they would take not only the conference resolutions, but the word of what they saw back to Jamaica and to Marcus Garvey. It is through them that Marcus Garvey decides to contact Booker T. Washington. And he does so. He begins to write him. And they begin to communicate and develop a relationship. Washington invites Garvey to see Tuskegee. But in the meantime, prior to that, the resolutions of the International Conference of the Negro would say, we are going to erect a Tuskegee-like institute. Well, if you know about the early history of Marcus Garvey, you know that he was traveling, before he came to the United States, he is traveling throughout the Caribbean, specifically places like Costa Rica. And he is raising money for a school. This is well documented. Well, what school? The school that is in the resolution of the International Conference on the Negro, to erect a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica. And so Washington and Garvey would have a relationship. And of course, I had to put the details of their correspondence in the book. There's a whole chapter on Pan-Africanism, and it addresses the birth and the coining of the phrase Pan-Africanism, the first Pan-African conference, the budding energy as Pan-Africanism is emerging in the world. And then, of course, I had to address Du Bois, and last but not least, the relationship and the reality and the history of Garvey. So Garvey, I wonder, I can't share everything, right? So I want to, okay. Here we go. Okay, so in 1914, Marcus Garvey wrote Booker T. Washington on several occasions. By the way, you could see all of this information in the Booker T. Washington papers. This is a teaching book, so it tells you exactly where to go. I pay for everything that's said at the bottom of the page with the footnotes, so you can take, you're right, you can look at it here, but you can go to that primary source and see that letter from Garvey to Washington and Garvey and Washington's response. They are all in the Booker T. Washington papers. The Schomburg has it. They used to be online, but presently I don't think that they are any longer. Anyway, so in 1914, Marcus Garvey wrote Booker T. Washington on several occasions. Although much of the dialogue between the two focused on Garvey's plan to enter the United States and raise money for the UNIA, he also kept Washington informed on the struggles of the African population, the African population faced in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean. His first letter to Washington, sent right before the first issue of the Negro World was released, was prophetic. He shared his vision for the UNIA and expressed his admiration for the Tuskegee model and his desire to implement it in Jamaica. He wrote, "Our organization is marching steadily on, and we hope to extend our scope all over the world within the next few years." And he would do just that, at least throughout the African world. Like many leaders, Garvey often faced considerable amount of opposition. In his letters to Washington, he detailed the litany of attacks he endured locally in the Jamaican press. Washington, who had his own chorus of critics, could relate. It was along these lines that the two men found a common experience in the struggle to advance their people. Garvey frequently wrote of his willingness to endure criticism for the sake of the greater good. In a letter to Washington on September 11, 1915, he echoed this sentiment again. "No one," so this is Garvey writing to Washington, "no one can understand more quickly than you the sacrifices and heartaches that accompany men who endeavor from the purest motives to do something in the interest of the people." End quote. Criticism of Garvey escalated to the point of personal attacks. His opposition primarily came from other African people in Jamaica that did not share his ideological views or mission embodied by the UNIA. Booker T. Washington invited Marcus Garvey to Tuskegee on several occasions and expressed a sincere willingness to assist him in establishing a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica. Exporting models of Tuskegee was a very intentional and ongoing initiative for Washington. However, before Garvey arrived, Booker T. Washington died in November of 1915. It was premature death by all accounts. Earlier that year, he challenged the African exclusion measure. I'm going further than I want to, but I'll get to that. That would have excluded Garvey and any other African person from entering the United States from anywhere in the world, particularly Central, South America, and the Caribbean. However, Garvey entered the United States and traveled to Tuskegee in March of 1916, 4 months after Washington's death. And now, let me tell you a little bit more. Okay, well, I could read it from here. Marcus Garvey wholeheartedly considered himself a disciple of Booker T. Washington. Almost each and every letter to Washington was signed, and you can go see this yourself, "Your humble and your most humble and obedient servant." the fact that Garvey, who became one of the most influential African nationalists and Pan-Africanist leaders to set foot on the international stage, considered himself Washington's obedient servant, spoke bygones. To Garvey, Washington was not the accommodationist many considered him to be. He viewed Washington's public stance as circumstantial and a reaction to the brutally racist climate that pervaded the United States at the time. I'm going to stop right there. But prior to what I just read, these are some of the things that we know. Marcus Garvey, in some correspondence between him and Washington, Marcus Garvey establishes that Booker T. Washington inspired him to be a race leader. He talks about it and he says that it was the reading of Up From Slavery that informed him of his destiny, so to speak, to be a race leader. And he says his doom to be a race leader. The Tuskegee model would inspire Marcus Garvey to establish and structure the UNIA after it. So what does that mean? Marcus Garvey would mail Booker T. Washington a pamphlet of the UNIA and tell him that he had structured the UNIA after the Tuskegee model. Well, and this is exactly what you see him do. He has multiple industries, right, in the UNIA as it is expressed here. That being said, so these are things I know. Some of you, we're in the same circles. I know you guys hear other people speaking. They say, you know, Garvey was an anomaly. No, he was not an anomaly. He had a blueprint, okay? He had a blueprint in Washington. He had a blueprint for the UNIA in the form of the Tuskegee model, and he was able to see the execution of that expressed at Tuskegee when he arrived in March of 1916. Washington would also, in death, be responsible for Garvey's ability to arrive in the United States. I'm going to naturally segue to the case, but it's not necessarily the way I wanted to deliver all of this. That being said, I don't know how much time I have, so please time check me. That being said, Garvey, in 1915, well, let's go back. In 1914, the Panama Canal would be completed. The main laborers on the Panama Canal were none other than the African and Black populations of the Caribbean, Central, and South America. The United States under Theodore Roosevelt would leap to being a superpower in the world by opening up the oceans, meaning opening up this passage between the Gulf connected to the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. If you ever notice, nobody ever flies over the Pacific Ocean, right? We go over the Atlantic. It's not suitable for that. So, that being said, whoever could figure out a way to cut through the land mass, because as you probably realize, the North and South American continents are connected. It is only through the Panama Canal, which was attempted by the French and they failed. It was a major engineering project. They couldn't do it. But under Theodore Roosevelt, they would achieve it. This cutting through the landmass and creating huge locks which would allow water to flood in and lift the ships above the remaining land mass, right? So it's like chambers. It sails in, the locks close, the ship is lifted, and then it goes to the next level. And it basically climbs what is remaining in terms of rock and land. Now you can go from the Gulf to the Pacific. And whoever did this would be a superpower in the world because they would open up trade between the East and the West. Well, the United States would be the first to do it under Theodore Roosevelt. Well, the population who would bear the brunt of the labor and hardship would be the African population in the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Many would die because of yellow fever. They were not paid the same. The administrators, it was an American project, so the administrators and the servicemen were in the U.S. military who were on the project. So there was the gold roll and the silver roll. The whites on the project were paid one thing, black people on the project were paid something different, okay, and had very different living. Go watch a documentary about the Panama Canal. It's the saddest thing, okay? Saddest thing, PBS has one. You will see how many people died in the process. That being said, the United States didn't use their own people except for as administrators. The laborers were us, but in the Caribbean, right? African people in the Caribbean. When it was completed in November of 1914. And this is important because they're watching and they're waiting, meaning U.S. politicians. They can figure and estimate that the people who labored on the Panama Canal would now want to immigrate to the United States. And so a senator from Missouri named James Reed would propose a piece of legislation in the larger immigration bill of 1914, which would end up being 1915. He would write into this piece of legislation, exclude anyone of the black or African race from the United States. And even further, in totality, in context, this piece of legislation would mean that they would put African and black people in the same category as criminals and undesirables attempting to enter the country. Literally, this is in the congressional record, the piece of legislation would go unchallenged. There would be no arguments in the Senate. It would pass with flying colors. And that is very ironic because he makes some other proposals to lock other groups of people out. Eastern, Indian, Asians, all of that. But it's only when he proposes this very specific line to exclude anyone of the black or African race does this exclusionary measure pass as a part of the larger immigration bill. So it is an amendment to the larger immigration bill, okay? They were so desperate to do this that they passed this on December 31st, 1914. And the canal had just been completed in November of 1914. They were like, we don't care that it's the last day of the year. We're about to get this in. Close the door. Because they could estimate that the people who had labored on the canal had gotten used to U.S. wages and would then attempt to immigrate to the United States, and they wanted to say no. No possibility. The measure passes December 31st in the Senate. It is due to go to the House of Representatives in January of 1915. Booker T. Washington stayed close to what was happening in the chambers of U.S. politicians. He saw this racist piece of legislation coming up before the House of Representatives. He was prepared. After communicating with several people to confirm what was going on the canal, he realizes that this is in fact coming before the Congress the first week of January 1915. This case is what gives me the right to sit here and say that Booker T. Washington, without a doubt, was a Pan-Africanist of the rarest form, because it would be him, he alone, who would initiate the struggle against this piece of legislation. He had 1 week from January 1st to January 7th to ensure that this measure would be defeated. He did not have to learn that he was an African in that 1 week, okay? He did not have to learn that to be from Haiti or Jamaica or from even Costa Rica or from Brazil or from Belize meant that you could also be an African person first and foremost and an identifiably black person. He didn't learn that week. He already knew that. In that 1 week, he is pushed to rally through the black press and expose this piece of legislation. That is his first move. He exposes this piece of legislation proposed by the Senate and passed by the Senate on December of 1914. He makes it clear that it is going to the House of Representatives this week, okay? And I'll read a couple of the publications in the press that he put out to make people aware of this. But more importantly, what happened is that he had a public effort to organize and oppose the measure, but he had a private method of defeating this measure as well, and that was none other than the Tuskegee machine. It would be through his secret network of power brokers that Booker T. Washington would send his lieutenants in the Tuskegee machine to Washington, D.C. to directly challenge U.S. politicians in the Congress. He would write many articles in challenging this measure, but his words in these articles in the black press would be echoed by a congressman from New York named Faulkner. So his words would reach the floor of the House of Representatives in opposition to this piece of legislation. But unbeknownst to the rest of them, or at least they would find out, his lieutenants, namely Francis Grimke, would be there in Washington, D.C. They would hold up the Congress. They would have a polling of the Congress. And all the while, in documentation, you can see Booker T. Washington sending wires to them. That's how they did it. So I would send a wire, a note, up to his lieutenants who would poll the Congress so that they could effectively target and lobby congressmen who they felt would be in favor of this racist piece of legislation. Grimke, Francis Grimke, a lieutenant on the Tuskegee machine, in the public realm seemed like an adversary or even sometimes a critic of Booker T. Washington. But the truth is, Grimke was not that. Francis Grimke was an ally of Booker T. Washington and part of this secret network of power brokers. There would be a ferocious debate on the floor of the House. Ferocious, okay? Each side, southern states, representatives from southern states, representatives from northern states, would debate this piece of legislation, talk about the usefulness or the unwanted presence of the African in America, and also talk about the African people from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, who they did not want to come into the United States. Let's be clear, because sometimes we are confused, okay? We are confused. I'm an educator, I know. I hear my students, I have heard my students echo some of the most ridiculous propaganda around this fact, okay? As though, as if there is a preferred African person, okay, amongst us here by white people. Preferred. Absolutely not. To this period, we can speak to that. So this is the first of Washington's letters, publications, articles about this piece of legislation that they proposed. Through your newspaper, I desire to appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in connection with the immigration bill now pending before the United States Senate, which by amendment excludes from coming into this country any person of African descent. Okay, and that was one of the first letters he wrote. Not letters, I'm sorry, first articles he wrote in reference to the African exclusion measure. The librarian crisis and the African exclusion measure predate the period and are evidence of early activity by African Americans to influence U.S. policy on behalf of African people abroad. So in other words, Washington in this case is challenging the U.S. government and U.S. politicians in favor of not African people already in the United States, but in favor of African people outside of the United States, who overwhelmingly are probably identifying by their nationality, okay, first and foremost, and who, we're gonna keep it real, who today may be confused around Black and African identity. And I'm saying that because he gets very specific about who they are talking about, okay? Washington's personal papers indicated that he was vehemently opposed to the passing of the clause, arguing that it was specifically designed to exclude Africans from the Caribbean, Central and South America, despite their contribution to the building of the Panama Canal. Upon learning of the proposed bill, Washington immediately contacted several of his political affiliates, urging them to write their senators and representatives, asking them to vote against the racist measure. However, that was not all. The very mechanism that he was so often criticized for, the Tuskegee machine, was his greatest tool in opposing the measure behind the scenes. One of the senators, and I included a lot of the conversation on the floor of the House. There's another version of this book that's coming out, but in the original version, this one, I give you enough to understand the level of the debate, the hostility around African immigration, okay? I want to give you some of what was being said. Okay, so this is a senator. Let me see something. Okay, yeah. Okay, so on December, to give you the actual verbiage language, on December 31st, 1914, Senator Reed, and this is the one who initiated this piece of legislation, of Missouri added a one-line sentence which became an amendment to the larger immigration bill. The amendment stipulated the exclusion of all aliens not of the Caucasian race. Much to Senator Reed's chagrin, this measure did not pass. Dissatisfied with the outcome, Senator Reed moved to amend the bill again, and this time he was more specific. He injected a one-line statement which read, "All members of the African or Black race." Before voting, a relatively short discussion began on the Senate floor. Senator Williams of Mississippi was the first to argue in favor of the amendment. He stated, "We are beginning to receive now some undesirable immigration of the African race from the West Indies. A great many Jamaican Negroes have been employed upon the Panama Canal, and after the termination of that work, having become accustomed to American wages, which they receive down in Panama, a great many more of them begin to come to the Gulf ports. Florida and Louisiana have already received a considerable portion of African immigration from the French and English West Indies. That is to say, immigration of West Indians who are wholly or partly African in race. So Washington is, watching this, right? He also, there's another piece of,
Stop whenever you get a question.
okay. He would write Washington in some of the articles. He wrote a particular article that said, the article was published in the New York World on January 2nd, 1915, under the title, Fair Play for Negro Aliens. Booker T. Washington argued that the amendment was in fact unnecessary and a slight to the masses of African Americans residing in the southern U.S. The article began with an appeal to Congress and American citizens. Through your newspaper, I desire to appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in connection with the immigration bill now pending before the United States Senate, which by this time it has passed, which by amendment excludes from coming to this country anyone of African descent. The article exposed the motivations behind the amendment, namely the recent completion of the Panama Canal. Washington also noted the inherent hypocrisy in constructing such a measure. Now that we are celebrating the completion of this great canal, it seems most unjust and unreasonable that people who contributed in so large a measure towards it should be slapped in the face and told that they cannot enter this country even when they meet the requirements of the government. Those are Washington's words. According to Washington, the bill wrongfully targeted African people from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, but in practice would exclude any person deemed African or black, in part or whole. Washington highlighted some of the population that could be denied immigration to the U.S. due to the clause. The bill, Washington's words, quote, the bill would seem to prohibit citizens from the republics of Liberia, Cuba, Haiti, and also from Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo from entering the country, thus placing the unnecessary hardship upon these smaller countries, which would not be done, in my opinion, if they were stronger. End quote. As Washington became more informed, he learned that the scope of the list extended to Jamaica, Trinidad, Panama, and Costa Rica. Nonetheless, it was not the nationality, but the specification of race and African ancestry that constituted the offensive nature of the measure. Booker T. Washington imposed the measure and used data from the 1910 census to argue that there were only 40,319 foreign-born Negroes in the United States, and only 473 of them had come from Africa. There were never a large number of African people entering the United States, and the measure would close the doors to African people immigrating from anywhere in the world. It is only because of the defeat of this measure that Garvey, 4 months after Washington's death, would be allowed to enter the United States. How does the measure get defeated? I already told you some of it, but you'll have to read for yourself. But in essence, the Tuskegee machine would effectively challenge U.S. politicians. They would poll them, challenge them, and when there was finally a vote, it was in defeat. Now, what was happening behind the scenes? Washington was the person who could be credited with the defeat of the measure. He used the black press, he used his secret network, and at the end, he actually says that had all failed, he did not care. He would go directly to Woodrow Wilson and demand that he veto this unfair and racist piece of legislation, okay? And he was not an advisor to Woodrow Wilson. If you know anything about Woodrow Wilson is seen as one of the most overtly racist presidents in the United States, okay, at that time. So that was no small thing to say, if all had failed, this president that I do not advise, and not an advisor to, I will go to him and demand that you veto this, because we're not going to allow it. But ultimately, in that debate, Washington's words are in that debate between congressmen on both sides. One congressman would discuss the fact that in favor of African and Black people, he would discuss the fact that the African story in America was in fact an epic story. And if it were any other people, 250 years of enslavement, 50 years of freedom, and we are in every industry that is to be had in this country. If it were any other people, we would be singing their praises because theirs is an epic story. And that is a quote. He's saying their story is an epic story, not simply in America, but in the world. No other story like that, okay? The defeat of a 250-year institution, and with only 50 years of freedom, rushing out and establishing their own communities. And of course, we could establish our communities because we had the skills in every industry. There wasn't an industry we didn't enslave it. So we were the holders of all the skills, and we put them to use for ourselves. However, that was a problem for the vast majority of white Americans, okay? And so this debate happens on the floor. Ultimately, the measure is defeated. But you can see Booker T. Washington writing to his lieutenants all the while. And one of the wires said, go to Washington, D.C. and defeat this unfair measure. Pull every string possible. Okay? Pull every string possible to defeat this unfair measure. And they did ultimately. But it is through the Tuskegee machine that they did. And Du Bois and Monroe Trotter are all aligned with Booker T. Washington in this instance. However, this was the the difference in the measure of power between them. Du Bois would create a secret society. You guys probably know it as the Boule.
That's right.
But it had no power to defeat the African exclusion measure. Nor were they probably too concerned. Trotter was unified with Booker T. Washington in the defeat of the African exclusion measure. But he had no Tuskegee machine either. One of his friends, George Cleveland Hall, would write Booker T. Washington and talk to him about the fact that they were all aligned against the African exclusion measure. And he wrote, the exclusionary amendment created unlikely, I'm writing this. The exclusionary amendment created unlikely alliances among African American leadership in the United States. They all vehemently opposed it. George Cleveland Hall, a mutual friend of both Booker T. Washington and Monroe Trotter, wrote to him on January 6, 1915. This is while this is all going on. He had recently received a copy of Washington's article protesting the bill from Trotter. And in his letter, Hall wrote to Washington, "For once, you two were agreeing upon the same thing, and he wished it could continue. I told him it could if he could see his way clear to stop from his bitter personal attacks upon you. When he left me, he said that he hoped that through the immigration bill, all factions might learn to stand on a common platform. He thought what a fine thing it would be for you, meaning Washington, Du Bois, and himself, Trotter, to appear in Washington arm in arm, fighting against the measure. He was willing to agree to an armistice until the fight was won, at least. So what is that saying? That is a friend of Monroe, Trotter, and Booker T. Washington, Wright in Washington, saying that Trotter had sent him a copy of Washington's article about the African exclusion measure, and saying that essentially Washington had done a good job to attack this measure. And they were all aligned along opposing this measure. And the friend says to him, essentially, that is a great thing. In this instance, you, Washington, Du Bois, and Trotter are all on the same page. And hopefully this can continue. But the difference between Washington and all others was that he had a measure of soft power. And he had a constituted mechanism, a tool, Tuskegee machine, to oppose, challenge, and defeat this racist piece of legislation. Everything all around us where we are would look different, okay, had he failed. I always say this when I do this lecture: if you like Barack Obama, say bye to him. No Barack Obama for you. No Malcolm for you. No Nkrumah in the United States for you. No Nnamdi Ezekwe in the United States and returning to Nigeria to lead his country against colonialism, right? Nkrumah, same likewise with Ghana, because no one who was African and identifiably black would have been allowed into the United States after 1915 had he failed. And so it is with this that Marcus Garvey, 4 months, so Washington defeats the African exclusion measure in January of 1915. He dies in November of 1915, okay, 11 months later, and Garvey would arrive in the United States in March of 1916, 4 months after Washington's death. And that would not have been possible without Washington's defeat of the African exclusion measure. So as it relates to Garvey, Washington is the person who inspired him to be a race leader. And those are Garvey's own words, not mine. He models UNIA after the Tuskegee model, as well documented in the historical record, the International Conference on the Negro and the resolutions in it to initiate a school, and then ultimately they have a relationship and communication. He writes to Washington that he structured the UNIA after the Tuskegee model. Washington extends invitations, as it says in the historical record, several times. And finally, he comes to the United States, but not before Booker T. Washington is able to defeat this pending piece of racist legislation, which without a doubt, because Jamaica is targeted, to be quite frank, in this legislation. They are fully aware that many of the laborers on the Panama Canal are coming from Jamaica. Okay? So by design, they were meant to be locked out, and it didn't work. And Garvey is able to enter the United States just 4 months after Washington's death, but really 1 year and 2 months after the defeat of the African exclusion measure.
They did not meet?
No. So, no, they didn't meet. So, they just missed each other, but they communicated. They had a relationship. And ultimately, it was a victory for us. But as it relates to Washington being a Pan-Africanist, I think you guys know our struggles. There are many people who look like us and still will hesitate to call themselves African, to call themselves even black. This is a struggle in much of Latin, so-called Latin America, okay? You know, the Indio, the Mestizo, the Creole, all of these people who are, in U.S. terms, identifiably black, but not identifying as black.
That's right.
Would have been locked out. So they wouldn't have even known to challenge the U.S. around this piece of legislation, right? Not then, not now. You can find people in New York right now who look like me and will tell you that they're, you know, something other than who they are.
I'm the man.
Right. So, in spite of the fact that these nations, island nations, are being targeted, and Central and South American nations are being targeted, there is a question about whether or not the people, right, the people or their governments would have challenged this piece of U.S. legislation, because the United States government was clear on who they were talking about, okay? But the people who were being talked about were not clear around the identity piece, okay, around the question of identity. Not then and not now. But Washington was clear. How was he so decisive? If such a measure arose today, I do not think that we could organize as swiftly as he did and as decisively as he did to destroy it in a week. By the time we figure out what we're trying to do, it would have already passed, and we would just be getting the news about it, okay? He had 7 days to execute, and he did that. And so there's great irony in that story because of the fact that Du Bois' chief criticism of Booker T. Washington is the Tuskegee machine. It is not the pseudo-programmatic difference. That is not real. It is the Tuskegee machine, but ultimately, it is the Tuskegee machine that Du Bois and others had to recognize and nod to, because it was the definitive piece of power that Washington had that the others just did not. Okay? Did not. And it doesn't mean that they had not formed circles of power in their lifetimes, but those circles of power were not uniquely defined or designed to advance the plight of African people here and abroad. It was not. All right? Don't get me started now about organizations created that did not serve the interests of African people. Okay? And so the Tuskegee machine is able to exact a victory for us and all African people, primarily abroad. And this is one thing that, you know, we have to deal with in terms of ethnic identity amongst us. We have our own issues, right? We have our own issues. But what this case does is help to establish a method and a means of challenging your racist government. So if you are in France and your government intends on producing legislation to lock out anyone of the African or black race, oh yes, it happens today, right? In the UK, they try it. In France, they try it. In Spain, they try it. In Italy, they try it. And we are leaving our homelands, which are exploited by European nations without a doubt, and forced to go to Western nations who then legislate to lock us out Well, here is your model on how to challenge your racist government and the legislation that they produce, okay? It has been done, and successfully, and we live in the blue flame, the hottest point of the struggle, without a doubt, okay? So that is one case in the book. I hope it addressed some of the fallacies of the Du Bois-Washington conflict. I hope it established for you the legislative record and history of this country to lock out African people. And I hope it also established for you that Washington was a champion of African people, not just domestically, but abroad. Okay? He was involved in advocating against racist policies created by the United States on behalf of African people, not inside the United States, but outside. Mm-hmm. And that's where we need to be moving, okay? So that is one case. The other case in the book is the Liberian crisis. I won't go into deep on it. It is Washington challenging the situation on the ground in Liberia. He is contacted by the Liberian officials, Liberian officials, and asked for advocacy in light of their situation on the ground in Liberia. Liberia is a very complicated situation, but I want to say that Booker T. Washington was, on the right side of history. He was not. There is a deeply problematic aspect of the Americo-Liberian ideation. It is unfortunate. I think that I'm definitely uniquely positioned to speak about it because I am a descendant of African people who defeated the institution of slavery. Mm-hmm. But we are also the same people who would go to Liberia with a dream to return to the African continent and betray our own people in the sense that we would create systems of marginalization that will marginalize the indigenous Liberian person. Ultimately, this is a problem. It caused many clashes between the so-called Americo-Liberian population and the indigenous Liberian population that was never displaced and enslaved there. The power, if you haven't noticed, in Liberia remains in one ethnic group because Americo-Liberians become an ethnic group who harness the power and utilize the power and are in relation with the United States and the powers that be as it would end up being expressed as a corporate entity, mm-hmm. Firestone eventually. We have to be critical of this. We have to be critical of this. And Washington was. So after helping to keep Liberia on the U.S. agenda, because the United States would not stake claim to Liberia at this time. This conflict would arise in 1907 to 1912. Just in short, to give you some of the facts. The U.S. government would not stake claims to Liberia because they were committed to exploiting Central and South America. That was what they were up to. They were not interested in Africa. They were going to leave that up to the French and the British, mm-hmm. right? And you know what the British said. The sun never sets on the British Empire. So, of course, the British had a great deal of seized with force, a great deal of the African continent. However, Liberia was not colonized by any of them. The United States would not stake claims because they knew to stake claims to Liberia would mean they would have to establish some economic relationship. And they were not going to do that. The American Colonization Society was already involved in resettling African people who survived slavery and wanted to be expatriated. And let's be clear, the American Colonization Society was a racist organization. They made no excuses for it. While Marcus Garvey and others, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner would be criticized for the desire to return back to Africa, the most successful Back to Africa movement was created and executed by a racist organization, the American Colonization Society, and its support from the U.S. government. They would expatriate successfully more people than any Back to Africa movement that we created ourselves. So just think about the irony. We're crazy when we say we want to return to Africa, but they're not crazy when they say go back to Africa. Mm-hmm. And do it and make it possible. So the people who would return back to Africa would contact the American Colonization Society because they were aware that they were financing expatriation back to the continent of Africa, Liberia specifically. So Washington is clear. He sees Liberia as a dream for us. Something that had never been done before for us. That being said, ultimately, in the end, Washington would be able to negotiate a deal for Liberia to come out of an attempt by the French, the British, and the Germans to encroach upon the territory. It was not the best deal. It was not a great deal. It was the kind of live to fight another day deal. It preserved Liberia in the moment. There are a couple of things that Liberia does not understand at the time but lose in the deal, meaning they agreed to allow Firestone in the country at some point. They also agreed to eventually allow a U.S. military base to be established in the future. However, when it is all over, and it is a long protracted case that Washington is involved in, Washington gives 3 recommendations to Liberia. The first is, and the most important, is to consume what you produce. He begins to discuss the fact that every time Liberians open a can in Liberia, imported from outside, they seal the fate of Liberian people in poverty. And so what he is telling them to do is to consume what you produce. Stop consuming Western goods. Those same things grow below your feet. Keep it. Produce it. Produce your industries here. Have your factories here in your country. And so that is his first, well, that's not really his first, but that's one of the 3. The other criticism and critique he gives is to resolve the conflict between the indigenous population and the Liberian and the so-called Americo-Liberian, the African who survived slavery and comes back to Africa. Resolve the issue. And he says this in favor of the indigenous Liberian population. He says that the indigenous population of Liberia has a very real and justified grievance. And he's right. Because the Americo-Liberian population was in the wrong posture. Okay? We brought racist ideology to Liberia and marginalized the indigenous African person who had never been displaced, okay? And used our proximity to whiteness in the context of America to assert this. right? So it's no coincidence that most of Liberia's presidents are Americo-Liberian, okay? That being said, Washington sharply criticized this. And there's been people who have not read the book, but seek to critique sort of the book without reading this detail, and assume that Booker T. Washington would have been on the side of the Americo-Liberian population. Yes, he hosts them. He does the most to make sure that Liberia survives. However, to the Liberian officials who are Americo-Liberian in ethnicity, if you will, some people don't like that term, Americo-Liberian, and I could see why. That being said, he would tell them that you are wrong. You are wrong. You are wrong. Okay? You cannot return to Africa, set up shop, and marginalize the indigenous African person. You're wrong. And he goes on to say that failure to resolve this conflict would determine the fate of Liberia. Okay? Because it would be destroyed from inside, the conflicts. And there were physical conflicts, right? And the U.S. government put Navy ships off the shore and would come inshore to put down clashes between Americo-Liberians and indigenous Liberian population at the time. And then lastly, he does what he does. He gives them a last and final recommendation that is to build a Tuskegee-like institute that would allow them to produce a cadre of people that could establish the industries, run the factories. And and so he is attempting to tell them what they need in order to advance and establish their African nation, okay, as it was. And he is the key negotiator in that case, a very long, protracted case. So he proves himself on two levels at two different times. And I do believe that the Liberian crisis gives him the wherewithal and understanding on an international level of how to resolve something like the African exclusion measure, which was hot, quick, and fast in terms of a problem and case. So I'm going to give you a couple more things, and then I'm going to end. I don't want to go all night, I'm sure.
That'll be part 2.
Yes. So let me tell you a little bit about this, funny and fun thing, and to understand about Washington, but compelling. Tuskegee, like I said, was a model, and few people, and I guess this is something that will be in the next book, few people have been able to define the Tuskegee model, but I give you as much of a definition as ever has existed in the public realm or on the historical record in this book. Most people don't know what the Tuskegee model is, but in this book I dedicate a whole chapter to the Tuskegee model and Africa. Because once perfected, that is what Booker T. Washington seeks to do with the model. And Washington had an interesting rivalry and vendetta with a man named Thomas Dixon. Thomas Dixon, some of you may know him, but the reason you may know him is not a good thing. He was the author of the book called The Klansman. This book is the book that is the basis for the film Birth of a Nation, the real film Birth of a Nation, the first one in 1900 or 1901. Thomas Dixon hated Booker T. Washington, and Thomas Dixon was a well-known racist in and out of the public realm, and he had a problem with Tuskegee. He had a problem with Booker T. Washington. He thought that Booker T. Washington had effectively wooed the white Southerners and Northern philanthropists in this country. He essentially said, you know, he's wooed you all and he has also fooled you about who he is because you don't understand what he's doing at Tuskegee. Well, hopefully you all will decide when you read the book, but this is what Thomas Dixon had said and wrote in an article he published in 1905 about Tuskegee. He said, Mr. Washington is not training Negroes to take their place in any industrial system of the South in which the white man directs or controls them. He is not training his students to be servants and come at the beck and call of any man. He is training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, to plant their own fields, buy and sell their own goods, and in every shape and form destroy the last vestige of dependence on the white man for anything. Every pupil who passes through Mr. Washington's hand ceases forever to work under a white man. Not only so, but he goes forth trained as an evangelist to preach the doctrine of separation and independence. Thomas Dixon called himself exposing Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee. And he wasn't all wrong. Tuskegee wasn't simply an industrial vocational school. Tuskegee was a school that taught nation building and nation management practices. I'm going to let you read the chapter and decide. But the 44 industries were representative of that. And Thomas Dixon was attempting to say to American whites, you haven't seen his face. He's wearing a mask. You know nothing of what he's doing at that school. And it didn't work, but today Tuskegee Institute, now university, produces more college-educated blacks that have established industries and businesses more than it has produced vocational persons or laborers. So I'll leave you there with some intrigue as to whether or not Thomas Dixon was correct about Tuskegee or not. I will say that he was closer to the truth than not, but you have to decide on your own, okay? I'm gonna leave it there.
Ladies and gentlemen, give this man a great big hand. Are there any questions and answers real quick?
All right.
Student audience.
Thank you.
This is just part one of the phenomenal work of Booker T. Are there any questions from the Zoom audience that you want to ask? Any questions?
Yes.
Going once? Zoom audience, going twice? Okay, from the floor, are there any questions?
Yes. About Booker T's reason for not going to the conference, but the boys went. Was it a specific reason? Was he ill? Was it? Do you know?
No, I couldn't tell from the record, from his personal papers, but I could take an educated guess, right, from knowing what was going on at that moment in time. Washington was unbelievably committed to Tuskegee. He was its father. He raised it. He was never going to leave it, not to go to Africa at that point, even though his personal feelings about wanting to travel to Africa and wanting to travel, period, are in the story of the Negro. But I think by the time the first Pan-African Conference is underway, he is tethered to Tuskegee, and he is not, that is his priority, that is his baby. And so he doesn't go. But Du Bois goes, and it is not because of their they were not in conflict in 1900. You know, they had a close and probably more than amicable sort of relationship, right? But do I know exactly the specifics of why he did not go to the conference? No, not really.
I wanted to thank you. I should have said this first. Thank you very much for coming and being well prepared and really giving it up to us.
No problem.
In our own
My
community.
pleasure.
1 second, Zoom. Go ahead, Doc.
Just 3 comments.
Uh-huh.
One comment is,
Yeah, let Doc and then
one
you come
comment
next.
I'd like to say is I will get the book because what it does for me is now to have somebody begin to lay out a blueprint of how to understand who he is and what he is, because most of us, at least me, I didn't know. So that's what I would say. I will use it as an educating tool for myself and then and my children, and then expand on it. The other, so that's just a statement. The question I want to ask about his statement to Liberia. Did Booker T. Washington understand? What is your opinion about how he understood that the fact that the United States sent 3 representatives and they sat in on the Berlin and Brussels conference? They were there. They supported, according to the record, they supported, helped the Germans, helped the Belgium, and pretty much was there to participate as an American. And then another part of the question is, did Booker T. Washington understand that by putting a certain African population into Liberia, that it might cause a conflict given the fact that many of those Africans put in there may not have come from Liberia?
Your first question was, should I take them in order or just?
Whichever way you want to answer,
Okay, the
so
first
we
one.
need to know.
Okay, the first question was, once again?
First question was,
Because I remember 2 and 3.
Booker T. Washington understand
The birth.
the fact that the United States interest in Africa, specifically Liberia, by sending 3 representatives there to sit in on the conference, they were part of it, that did he understand that the United States may have considered that move their colony? Because it's always said that the United States never had a colony in Africa. Did he view it as maybe the United States' attempt to get its foothold there as a colony, that they've sent representatives there, and that did they bring Africans from America into Liberia that weren't from Liberia?
Okay, so on the first question, so he was, at the time that the Liberian crisis arises in 1907, he is an advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt. And there is a change in the administration. It's a very compelling case because during the Liberian crisis, there would be a change in the U.S. administration from Theodore Roosevelt to Taft. And he would actually hold a secret meeting, invite, on the cover of the book, you see there's people in the shadows. Who is that? Those are the members of the Library Commission to the United States. The real picture is here. And this is only from Tuskegee University archives. It's a picture of a group, the librarian delegation to the U.S. in the midst of this conflict, and Washington hosts them in Tuskegee and then brings them back to Washington, D.C., where he hosts a secret meeting between the members of the delegation, which are president, former president, and a vice president. No, a vice president, former president, and one other librarian official. He hosts this meeting, secret meeting, in the United States in 1907 at the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt incumbent President Theodore Roosevelt, President-elect Taft, Elihu Root who is the Secretary of State. Those three top officials, the president, the standing president, the president-elect, and the Secretary of State, heading the State Department. He hosts this secret meeting between all of those parties because he is trying to protect the negotiations on behalf of Liberia. He knows that Roosevelt coming out of office and Taft assuming office, they could easily say, oh, well, you know, that fell to the wayside. It's not on the new president's agenda. So he's trying to protect negotiations on behalf of Liberia. He is aware of the fact that the United States, even though if you read the case, Theodore Roosevelt says, go ahead, I support you. We're going to back Liberia. We're going to protect Liberia. But the reality is that to say you back Liberia in the world then and now is to make economic, give economic security to Liberia. And the United States is making no claims to Liberia. And let me just say this, it's not because they don't want to colonize anything. They don't have anything against colonizing anything or anywhere. It's just that their focus is on colonizing in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. That's where their focus is, right? And so they're like, you know, that's not on our agenda. We're going to let the Europeans do that, okay? They know also to make state claims to Liberia is to say we are going to economically support Liberia. They don't want to do that. They are asked over and over again about their claims, not by Liberians, but by the European forces on the ground. They are asked about their relationship repeatedly by the British, by the French specifically. And the British and the French are threatening to imitate each other on opposing borders of Liberia. If they take this, then we're going to take this. Do you all want this? U.S. government? Are you stating claims? Because they're not concerned about the indigenous people. They're concerned about another power, and by this time, the United States is a pretty major power in the world. The Panama Canal isn't done. They're not, leaders of all trade at this point, but they are a major power in the world, and so they're concerned about an opposing power, the United States, meaning they, the French and the British specifically. So the United States repeatedly says they have no interest in Liberia. They affirm the Monroe Doctrine that they would stay out of Africa. They're not interested in seeking territories in Africa. But we could say, it's sort of like a proxy situation. They're not getting involved in terms of the form of their government. But yes, some of the Americo-Liberian population clearly has the wrong idea, right? About what should be happening in Liberia. You cannot do that. You cannot go anywhere and displace the indigenous population. You cannot go anywhere and marginalize the indigenous population. And so that is what happened. Washington was not on the side of the Americo-Liberian, which is why, let me be clear, because I said it wrong when I was speaking. His first criticism is of the conflict between the Americo-Liberian and indigenous population. He's saying failure to resolve this problem will be the death of this nation. Okay? And the Americo-Liberian is justified because what has happened, I mean, not the, I'm sorry, the indigenous Liberian is justified because the Americo-Liberian has come and set up a system of discrimination that has marginalized the indigenous Liberian population. So let me be clear. Washington, and even I am saying, the Americo-Liberian population is wrong because they set up a system of discrimination against the indigenous African population in Liberia. And wrongfully so, you know? And we all know about that. Taylor, all of Liberia's presidents pretty much, are Americo-Liberian. Few of them are, indigenous Liberian ethnic groups, which led to, it sowed the seeds of war in that country. Okay? It is the reason for all the wars we've seen in Liberia. That is the seeding of that. Two, I don't know that Booker T. Washington, he would have known about the United States' role in the Berlin Conference. In chapter 4 of this book, I talk about Booker T. Washington and his African nationalist affiliates. There is one very dark moment in Tuskegee's history, and that is the Togo expedition, where before Washington is fully educated, there is a moment in his life where he is educating himself, aggressively educating himself on Africa and all things related to Africa as well as the people. But he doesn't understand everything. He is friends with, and that situation, the Togo expedition goes shamefully wrong. Now there are people right now who dare to enter this discourse and are not educated enough on the history and the details and the very complicated and layered details of this history. So Tuskegee and Tuskegee graduates do go to Liberia and participate. Let me not say set up, because they didn't set up anything. It was the Germans. It was a German colonial expedition. And about 4 to 8 or 9 Tuskegee graduates go there to do what they do, which is produce an industry. They are involved in crossbreeding cotton, producing cotton, and showing the populations there on how to produce this. The Germans are in their normal colonial imperialist posture, and they are exploiting Togo, right? Most of the Tuskegee graduates who go to Togo to share their knowledge of cotton production all die, except for one. It's a catastrophe for Tuskegee. But it is not spearheaded by Tuskegee, right? It is the German colonial regime. Washington learns in this situation that your posture and the vein in which you get to Africa matters. He is overzealous. He is eager. He knows he's never going to go to Africa, but he feels like I can send my students and I can export the model. And he jumps at the first opportunity to put Tuskegeans on the continent of Africa. This is a problem because it's the wrong circumstance. It's the worst circumstance. Some people who don't understand and will not dive into the 15 volumes of the Booker T. Washington papers, which will give them the nuances and the details of all of this, wrongfully interpreted as Tuskegee attempted to colonize the Togo. Nothing could be more wrong. I mean, Tuskegee is a sustainable black community that masqueraded as a school. It is not a nation that had the wherewithal to colonize anyone. And to be clear, further in the book on this issue of colonization, When asked, out of confusion, if Washington is in favor of colonizing the Negro in the Sudan in this instance, he responds to a white venture capitalist that he is not interested in colonizing the Negro anywhere, period. Okay? So he entertains Back to Africa movement because he is friends with Bishop Henry McNeill Turner. And he explores the possibility of resettling in Africa. And his assessment in this is that there is nowhere on the continent of Africa where Europeans had not already colonized, and when they had not colonized that territory, they used this very ambiguous term that this territory was in their sphere of influence. And so he said, basically, no, the African continent is not suitable for our return because they're all over the place, the imperialists. And he would better take his chances here than go to the continent of Africa and be under the foot of some European colonial regime. So yes, he understood completely about the Berlin Conference, its implications, and what it was in practice doing on the continent at that moment in time in history. Last question. Okay.
All right, Zoom, last
I got
question.
two. Wait, I got two.
This is an excellent presentation, Sister Wright.
Hold up. Hold up.
Very important.
Munderson, hold up.
Go ahead. Let him go.
Hello?
I'll come back to you. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Mundy.
Let him go.
Yeah, I'm saying that, Sister Wright, this is an excellent presentation about a very important man. I simply want to make a comment.
Yes.
It has to do with what Professor John Clark said. Now, however black leaders engage in an issue, what really matters is the results. Okay, Dr. Clark, in analyzing Booker T's Washington's Atlanta exposition speech, he made a quote. He said, Booker T did a little torment. But what was most important is that he established an institution that 100 years later is effectively doing the job of his original intent. So whatever we do, okay, if it is in the interest of our people, that is all that matters. But some of these people that go around and claiming to be black and cannot produce, they need to be scrutinized more fully. And again, I want to say, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you
Okay,
very
you
much.
got another question, Doc?
Okay, yeah, I'm too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
I was just curious,
Very.
Okay.
curious in terms of your analysis. How would you explain to us as quickly as you can the circumstances around his institution that gave that institution that ability to work with the top people in white America? That's the question. To the president, how does an African-based organization get to be influential enough to deal with the president?
Let me tell you, this subject matter, there's so much covered here in the book that, and it's a small book, so you'd be surprised that much ground is covered. That being said, I do cover that to a certain extent. I tell the story of Tuskegee and what Tuskegee truly is. Real brief, because a lot of people don't know this, and sometimes I usually start, my lecture or presentation on this. Booker T. Washington is not the founder of Tuskegee. He is not the founder of Tuskegee. A man who survived the institution of slavery named Lewis Adams is the founder of Tuskegee. And he was well known in the Tuskegee community Tuskegee was considered very progressive during the Reconstruction period. And then you know that we suffer a rollback in 1877 at the end of radical Reconstruction. But Tuskegee is a pretty progressive place. Macon County is a solid black county in the black belt, but surrounded by white counties. And Lewis Adams is a community leader. And there's much more to the story, but I can say he was a community leader, and he is approached by Foster to rally the black vote in favor. And Foster is a white politician. He's a senator in the state of Alabama, and he approaches Lewis Adams. Lewis Adams agrees to help Foster rally the black vote in favor of Foster. This happens successfully. When Foster comes back to Lewis Adams, he's fulfilled a political favor for him. He ultimately asked him, "What do you want?" Right? Lewis Adams, "What do you want?" I've been reelected. And Lewis Adams is sort of like the embodiment of our people at that moment in time. He says something very simple and powerful. He says, "I want a school for my people." He didn't ask for a personal favor. He didn't ask for a payoff. He didn't ask for a plot of land, a team of oxen, or anything. He asked for what was reflective of our values at that moment in time, 1 foot out of enslavement. And he said, "A school for my people." Foster goes back to the state of Alabama and gets an allocation of $2,000 for the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee. Nothing else, just allocation to pay for teachers. No land, no books, no nothing. It is then when he comes back with that they begin to organize, Lewis Adams and others, to get a space for the school, which is a small AME church there in Tuskegee. Washington would be recommended by Armstrong. And let me be very, very clear, because I've heard other scholars who don't know the history, hasn't cracked one book of the Booker T. Washington papers, have talked about Tuskegee being a model of Hampton. It is not. It was not. Not at all. Hampton never got as far in terms of the development of its sustainable industries as Tuskegee did, and I don't know that they wanted to. Hampton is a totally different entity. That being said, they would write Armstrong would send Booker T. Washington. Washington would raise the school, and that's why I always refer to Booker T. Washington as the father of Tuskegee. But he is not the conceptual founder of Tuskegee. Lewis Adams is. It was his concept, and it was his selflessness that opened the door for Tuskegee to be established. After that, Washington comes, and Washington would do something that is uniquely a signature of Booker T. Washington. Even then, he understands the importance of independence. Washington somehow figures out, once he comes, that he's going to build this school, and that he can raise more money for this school than the state could ever give them. So he tells, and he's connected to Ford at this time, and he intends to travel with Ford. So he tells the state of Alabama to keep there for $2,000 a year for teachers. He's going to go on the road with Ford, and he's going to raise the money for the school. And he establishes a new and second charter. So Tuskegee has 2 charters. 1881, our original founding, Negro Normal School at Tuskegee. And then 1893, which is the Tuskegee Institute Charter, which reestablishes as a school for teachers. who teach the academics and perfect the trades. Washington raises the money for Tuskegee, and he makes the institution independent of the state of Alabama. And that's why today Tuskegee has a very unique classification that maybe only one other institution has. It is a private school, but state affiliated when it needs to be. It is called quasi-private. So it is independent and state affiliated when it needs to be. In other words, when it is to its benefit to be affiliated with the state. But Washington did what a Booker T. Washington would do. He took the school from the state and gave it back to the people. Not to mention that most of the land, a great deal of the land at Tuskegee was donated by formerly enslaved and others. When he reestablishes, when he does the second charter, he has a board, and this is how some wealthy white philanthropists get involved in the institute. They would get an injection of money. Very often they would name a building after whomever. But it would allow him to put money into the sustainable model. The long-standing labor force at Tuskegee, for majority of its first 50 years, more than that, so 1881 to the 70s, until the 70s, I know this for sure, most of the labor force are the students. Everyone that came to Tuskegee was on the 5-year program. You worked full-time for the institution the first year, and you went to school part-time, and the 4 remaining years you went to school full-time and you worked for the institution part-time. This allowed them, and they were paid. They were not exploited. So this allowed many people to go to school without having to worry about paying fees, and to also earn a living to sustain themselves while at school. So to answer your question about Washington, I would love to give you the inside conversation, and maybe when we turn the cameras off, sorry folks at home, I will give you a more personal conversation about what's said at Tuskegee. But Booker T. Washington was this sort of person. In this book you will see at a moment in time during the Liberian crisis, he writes to Theodore Roosevelt, "Do you have this man's name, Mr. Fissel, or something to that effect? Please give me his information. I'm trying to get him interested in Africa, but he's not quite interested. I'm probably going to try again. But I want his name because I'm looking at Tuskegee's endowment," and this is early 1900, early 20th century. "I'm looking at Tuskegee's endowment. It's 1 million. It should be 4. Give me that man's information, because I want that money. So my point is that his relationship with them was very utilitarian, and he kept it that way. Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is just going to be a part 1 of the great Booker T and what's going on. Give Miss Tyree Wright a great